By the dawn of the 3rd millennium BCE, long before the names of Zeus or Athena were spoken, the islands and coasts of the Aegean were already home to complex societies whose beliefs, architecture, and symbols would later form the substrate of Greek myth. The story of Greek mythology begins not with Olympus, but with the stone and bronze cultures that emerged amid the fragmented geography of the Aegean basin. Archaeological evidence indicates that by around 3000 BCE, 3 distinct yet interconnected civilizations were developing: the Cycladic, the Minoan, and the early Helladic cultures. Each evolved within an environment defined by mountains, narrow plains, and a sea that linked, rather than separated, their communities. This geography fostered both isolation and exchange, creating the conditions from which the earliest mythic frameworks would later emerge. The Cycladic civilization, centered on the islands of the central Aegean, is best known through its minimalist marble figurines, stylized female forms with folded arms, dating between 2800 and 2300 BCE. Archaeologists interpret these figures as representations of fertility or household deities, suggesting a ritual system focused on life cycles rather than anthropomorphic gods. Excavations on Syros, Kuros, and Naxos reveal organized settlements and maritime trade networks extending toward Anatolia and Crete. The uniformity of Cycladic art and burial practices indicates shared cultural norms, yet no evidence of centralized authority, an early expression of the localized autonomy that would remain a constant in Greek civilization. To the south, on Crete, a different trajectory was unfolding. Around 2600 BCE, the Minoan civilization began to dominate Aegean trade. Excavations at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea, first systematically studied by Sir Arthur Evans in the early 20th century, uncovered palatial complexes with advanced plumbing, storage facilities, and frescoed halls depicting ritual processions and natural scenes. The Minoans' undeciphered linear script and the absence of fortifications suggest a society that prioritized administration and ritual over warfare. Their iconography, the double axe, Labres, the bull, and the snake goddess, reflects a rich symbolic language rooted in fertility and cosmic renewal. Later Greek myths, particularly those surrounding King Minos, the Minotaur, and the Labyrinth, likely preserve distant echoes of this Bronze Age Cretan culture. On the Greek mainland, the early Helladic period, ca. 2800 to 2000 BCE, was marked by smaller settlements and less monumental architecture. However, by 2000 BCE, influences from Crete and Anatolia introduced new technologies and social structures. Fortified sites like Lerna and Tiryns reveal increasing political centralization. The so-called House of the Tiles at Lerna, a large, multi-roomed administrative building destroyed by fire, provides evidence of hierarchical organization and possibly early proto-palatial authority. Archaeological continuity between these mainland centers and later Mycenaean sites suggests that the foundations for Greek heroic culture were already being laid in this formative era. The interaction among these 3 cultures, Cycladic, Minoan, and Helladic, created a dynamic exchange of ideas, materials, and symbols. Bronze tools, imported obsidian, and ceramic styles circulated widely, reflecting a maritime network that extended to Egypt and the Levant. These exchanges introduced foreign religious motifs. Egyptian-style seated goddesses, Syrian bull iconography, and Mesopotamian cylinder seals all appear in Aegean contexts by the late 3rd millennium BCE. Such diffusion provided the visual and conceptual vocabulary from which later mythic imagery would draw: the storm god, the mother goddess, the serpent guardian, each rooted in an earlier, pan-Mediterranean tradition of divine representation. By the mid-2nd millennium BCE, climatic shifts and increasing trade intensified contact across the eastern Mediterranean. On Crete, the Minoans reached their zenith around 1700 to 1450 BCE, constructing a network of palatial centers linked by a shared religious and administrative system. The frescoes of Knossos depict bull-leaping ceremonies and processions of priestesses, suggesting a ritual order emphasizing cyclical renewal and divine kingship. Some scholars interpret the Minoan king-priest as the prototype of the later Minos, whose semi-divine authority in myth mirrors the Minoan fusion of political and sacred power. This early synthesis of ritual and governance established a model that would persist in Greek thought, the alignment of human order with divine will. Meanwhile, on the mainland, the rise of the Mycenaean civilization after 1600 BCE transformed the political landscape. The shaft graves of Grave Circle A at Mycenae, excavated by Heinrich Schliemann in 1876, contained gold masks, weaponry, and imported luxury goods, evidence of a warrior elite engaged in long-distance exchange. The Linear B tablets, discovered later at Mycenae, Pylos, and Thebes, record the earliest known form of the Greek language, confirming that the Mycenaeans were ethnically and linguistically Greek. These texts detail administrative inventories of goods, livestock, and personnel, offering insight into a highly organized palatial economy. Religion, too, appears in these records. References to deities such as Potnia, Mistress, Poseidon, and Dios, Zeus, reveal the earliest attestations of figures who would later dominate Greek mythology. The Mycenaean palaces, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes, were fortified citadels commanding surrounding agricultural plains. Their megaron halls, decorated with frescoes of hunting and ritual, served both political and religious functions. The depiction of chariot processions, feasting scenes, and offerings to gods suggests a social order that celebrated martial prowess while maintaining complex cultic traditions. Archaeologists have noted the continuity between Minoan and Mycenaean iconography. The double axe, the griffin, and the bull remained central motifs, indicating cultural inheritance rather than replacement. The Mycenaeans adopted and reinterpreted these symbols within a more hierarchical and militarized context, laying the groundwork for the later mythic narratives of kings, warriors, and divine ancestry. By around 1450 BCE, the Mycenaeans had extended their influence over Crete, occupying Knossos and adopting aspects of Minoan administration. This period of cultural synthesis produced the hybridized religious landscape that would shape the later Olympian pantheon. The goddess figures of Minoan cults, associated with fertility, nature, and renewal, likely evolved into later deities such as Demeter, Artemis, and Aphrodite. Similarly, the Mycenaean sky and storm deities presaged Zeus and Poseidon, while household and underworld spirits anticipated later chthonic traditions. This blending of Minoan ritual imagery with Mycenaean warrior ideology marks the true genesis of Greek mythological structure, the transition from local cults to a pan-Hellenic divine order. Interpretively, this era demonstrates how environmental and economic systems shaped religious concepts. The dependence on maritime trade fostered deities linked to navigation and the sea. Agricultural reliance promoted fertility cults tied to seasonal cycles. The Mycenaean emphasis on hierarchical kingship encouraged myths of divine descent, legitimizing rule through divine sanction. Each mythic motif can thus be traced to the functional realities of Bronze Age life, a civilization interpreting its environment through symbolic narrative. By the late 13th century BCE, however, signs of instability appeared. Fortifications were expanded, suggesting increased warfare. Linear B records cease abruptly after 1200 BCE, coinciding with the widespread collapse of Bronze Age states across the eastern Mediterranean, the so-called Late Bronze Age collapse. Archaeological destruction layers at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos point to systemic disruption, possibly due to internal conflict, natural disaster, or external invasion. As the palatial systems disintegrated, centralized administration vanished, and literacy disappeared for centuries. Yet the oral traditions of the Mycenaean age, stories of kings, wars, and divine favor, endured, transmitted through generations and later crystallized into the Homeric epics and the mythic genealogies of the archaic Greeks. As the palaces fell and the scripts were forgotten, Greece entered a period of fragmentation and obscurity. Yet in that silence, the memory of the Bronze Age survived, reshaped by oral tradition into the mythic age that would define the next chapter of Greek civilization. In the centuries following the fall of the Mycenaean palaces, the Greek world entered a prolonged phase of fragmentation. The once centralized systems of administration, trade, and literacy vanished. The Linear B script used for palace record-keeping disappeared entirely, and with it, the bureaucratic order that had sustained the Bronze Age kingdoms. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos shows layers of destruction dated around 1200 BCE, followed by centuries of reduced settlement density. This period, traditionally known as the Greek Dark Age c. 1100 to 800 BCE, was not a total collapse but a transformation, a shift from palatial organization to decentralized village communities. The loss of writing did not mean the loss of memory. In the absence of scribes, history and myth survived through oral transmission. The memory of Mycenaean kings, wars, and divine favor endured in song. Bards and storytellers became the custodians of collective identity, reciting heroic tales at communal gatherings. These oral traditions preserved fragments of the Bronze Age past, gradually merging history with myth. Archaeologists and historians recognize in this continuity the foundations of the Homeric epics, which would later transform oral memory into literary canon. Material culture during this period reflects both decline and adaptation. Excavations at Lefkandi on the island of Euboea reveal a remarkable settlement active during the 10th century BCE. There, a monumental building, interpreted as a hero's tomb or proto-temple, contained rich grave goods, including imported jewelry and a pair of horses buried alongside a cremated couple. Such finds indicate that elite customs and long-distance connections persisted even amid political decentralization. Lefkandi thus represents continuity in ritual practice, suggesting that the idea of heroic status remains central to Greek social thought even after the fall of kings. Similarly, the site of Nicoria in Messenia provides evidence for agricultural resilience and evolving community structure. Houses became simpler, but new forms of social organization emerged, centered around kinship and shared labor. Pottery styles, such as proto-geometric ware, display renewed technical skill and aesthetic innovation, marking a gradual cultural recovery. Iron technology, introduced during this period, replaced bronze as the dominant metal, reshaping economic systems and social hierarchies. The transition from bronze to iron mirrored the shift from palace economies to local autonomy. Despite regional isolation, a network of cultural exchange slowly reformed across the Aegean. Trade contacts with Cyprus, the Levant, and Anatolia resumed by the 9th century BCE, reintroducing foreign goods and artistic motifs. Yet the memory of the Mycenaean world persisted less through artifacts than through narrative. Genealogies of heroes Atreus, Agamemnon, Achilles served as bridges between the distant Bronze Age and the present. Communities traced their origins to legendary ancestors, using myth as a framework for identity in the absence of written history. This period also saw the evolution of religious practice. Shrines dedicated to local deities appeared on hilltops and in caves, marking a transition from palace cults to communal worship. Many of these sanctuaries, such as those at Delphi and Olympia, have roots in the Dark Age, showing that religious memory endured even as political structures dissolved. The gods of later Greek religion, Zeus, Hera, Apollo, took shape through this continuity. Their names preserved from the linear B tablets, but their characters developed through oral storytelling and local cult tradition. By the late 9th century BCE, population growth and increasing interaction among regions signaled the end of isolation. Villages coalesced into larger settlements, trade expanded, and new social hierarchies emerged. The alphabet, adapted from Phoenician models around the 8th century BCE, restored literacy to Greece, providing the medium through which oral traditions could finally be recorded. It was in this renewed cultural landscape that epic poetry would take written form, transforming centuries of spoken memory into enduring literature. By the close of the Dark Age, Greece had reconnected with the broader Mediterranean world. The palatial kings of the Bronze Age were gone, but their echoes remained in legend. The people who built the new city-states inherited both the ruins and the stories of their ancestors. Out of these oral traditions, preserved through centuries of anonymity, a poet would soon arise, one whose verses would bind gods and men, myth and memory, into the fabric of Greek identity. With Homer, Greece found its mythology, and the gods found their voices. By the 8th century BCE, after centuries of oral tradition, the scattered tales of heroes and divine caprice were woven into unified epics that defined Greek identity. The Iliad and the Odyssey, attributed to Homer, stand as the first comprehensive articulation of the mythic universe inherited from the Bronze Age. Composed in epic hexameter and performed in the Ionian dialect, they transformed centuries of oral storytelling into a structured cosmology where gods and mortals coexisted within a shared moral and historical order. Archaeological and linguistic evidence places the composition of the Iliad and Odyssey between 750 and 700 BCE, during the early Archaic period, a time of renewed literacy, colonization, and social reorganization. These poems, transmitted orally by rhapsodes, were not private compositions but public performances. They served as communal acts of remembrance, recited at festivals and gatherings across the Greek world. In this context, Homeric poetry functioned as both entertainment and education, preserving collective memory while articulating values of honor, time, glory, kleos, and fate, Moira. The oral formulaic structure, characterized by repeated epithets and stock phrases, reflects its deep roots in the bardic tradition of the Dark Age. The Iliad presents a cosmos of tension between divine will and human agency, mortality and immortality, order and chaos. The Olympian gods intervene freely in the Trojan War, reflecting a divine hierarchy already well established in Greek belief. Zeus rules as the arbiter of fate, maintaining a balance among gods and men, while Hera, Athena, Apollo, and Ares pursue personal agendas that mirror human passions. The gods are powerful but not omnipotent. They act within constraints set by Moira, the impersonal force of destiny. This theological structure, a council of gods governed by fate, became the defining cosmology of Greek religion. It reflected a world no longer centered on divine kingship, as in Minoan or Near Eastern systems, but on negotiation among autonomous powers. The Odyssey, by contrast, explores the interaction between human cunning and divine oversight. Odysseus, the most adaptable of heroes, survives through intelligence, métis, rather than strength. His encounters with Athena, Poseidon, and lesser deities illustrate a moral order in which divine favor depends on human virtue and prudence. The gods are not remote. They act within human affairs, rewarding piety and punishing arrogance. This conception of reciprocal obligation between mortal and divine, expressed through xenia, hospitality, and hubris, excess, would become a cornerstone of Greek ethical thought. Linguistic studies of Homeric Greek reveal deliberate archaism, suggesting continuity with earlier oral dialects traceable to Mycenaean times. Words and formulas preserved in the epics correspond to terms found in linear B tablets, wanax, lord, potnia, mistress, and references to deities such as Poseidon and Dios, Zeus. This retention of archaic elements indicates that Homer's language was a synthetic construct, a poetic dialect preserving memory of a heroic past. Thus, the Homeric corpus bridges the Mycenaean and archaic worlds, transforming oral memory into an enduring cultural framework. The social world depicted in the epics also reflects this transitional age. The palatial economy of the Bronze Age is replaced by a society of independent chiefs, basileis, bound by personal alliances and martial codes. Wealth derives from livestock and plunder rather than centralized administration. The hero's value is measured by personal excellence, arete, and reputation. These attributes aligned with the evolving ethos of the emerging polis, providing a moral vocabulary that would shape civic life in the centuries to come. In this sense, Homer's epics not only preserved myth but also codified the ideals of the early Greek world. The divine order in Homer is anthropomorphic yet bound by hierarchy. Zeus maintains authority through deliberation and consensus, a reflection of human political evolution toward assembly and debate. The Iliad's divine council parallels the deliberative institutions of early Greek communities, where power was distributed among equals rather than centralized. The theological model mirrored social organization, a pantheon of individual wills under a guiding order, just as the polis balanced autonomy and unity. This analogy between cosmic and civic order would later underpin Greek philosophy and political thought. Archaeological correlations reinforced the historical realism beneath Homeric myth. The site identified as Hizarlik in northwestern Anatolia, excavated by Heinrich Schliemann and later by Manfred Korfmann, reveals multiple destruction layers, one of which, Troy VIA, corresponds to the approximate period of the Iliad's events. While no direct evidence confirms the Trojan War as described, the convergence of trade, conflict, and migration in the Late Bronze Age provides plausible historical foundations. Similarly, Mycenaean artifacts from Pylos and Mycenae correspond to descriptions of palatial grandeur, while the geography of Ithaca and the Ionian Islands aligns with the Odyssey's maritime settings. Through Homer, mythology became literature, and literature became history's vessel. The epics unified regional traditions into a shared cultural canon, transforming local cults and legends into a coherent vision of the Greek past. In doing so, they defined the moral and cosmological order of the Hellenic world. The heroes of the Iliad embodied the virtues of courage and endurance. The trials of Odysseus illustrated resilience and intellect. Together they established the archetypes through which later generations would interpret human nature and divine law. By the close of the 8th century BCE, the Homeric poems had achieved Pan-Hellenic status, recited at festivals such as the Panathenaea in Athens. Their language, imagery, and theology provided the foundation upon which all subsequent Greek mythography, drama, and philosophy would build. Yet Homer's cosmos, though vivid and complete, remained without a systematic account of creation. The lineage of the gods, their origins, and the ordering of the universe still awaited formal articulation. Out of this poetic cosmos, another voice would soon emerge, one that sought to explain not just the deeds of the gods, but the structure of their world. The cosmos Homer described would soon be ordered, line by line, by another poet. Hesiod gave the Greeks what they had never possessed, a divine family tree. Composed around 700 BCE, the Theogony of Hesiod of Askara represents the first systematic attempt to organize the multiplicity of Greek deities into a coherent theological structure. Where Homer had portrayed the gods in action, powerful yet individualized, Hesiod traced their origins, relationships, and succession. The poem established not merely a pantheon but a cosmology, a genealogy of power that linked the natural world, divine order, and moral law within a single poetic framework. It was the birth of theology in Greek thought, an attempt to rationalize the divine through sequence and descent. The Theogony opens with the primordial void, chaos, from which all things arise. Out of chaos emerge Gaia, earth, Tartarus, the underworld, and Eros, desire. Hesiod's narrative begins not with a creator god but with the spontaneous appearance of forces, spatial, chthonic, and generative. This cosmogony differs from the anthropocentric accounts of Near Eastern mythologies. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, creation results from divine combat. In Hesiod, it is a process of emergence and succession, a reflection of an ordered but impersonal cosmos. Yet cross-cultural parallels are evident. The succession of Uranus, Cronus, and Zeus mirrors the generational conflicts of Hittite and Hurrian myths, such as the storm god Teshub's overthrow of his father Kamarbi. These similarities suggest that Hesiod's vision was shaped by a broader Eastern Mediterranean exchange of mythic traditions. The first generation of deities represents elemental principles. Gaia produces Uranus, sky, and together they give birth to the Titans, Cyclopes, and Centimanes, embodiments of natural and cosmic forces. When Uranus confines his children within the earth, Gaia incites her son Cronus to rebellion. With a sickle of flint, Cronus castrates his father, separating heaven from earth, a symbolic act marking the establishment of cosmic order through violence. From Uranus's blood are born the Erinyes, Furies, giants, and Aphrodite, illustrating how disorder continually generates new forms of existence. Hesiod thus presents the cosmos as a moral process. Power arises from conflict, and creation from transgression. Cronus's reign, though initially stable, replicates the pattern of tyranny and fear. Warned that one of his offspring will overthrow him, Cronus devours his children as they are born. His consort Rhea, with Gaia's help, hides the infant Zeus in a cave on Crete, substituting a stone for the newborn. When Zeus matures, he compels Cronus to regurgitate his siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, and leads them in revolt against the Titans. This Titanomachy, the war of gods and Titans, becomes the central drama of divine succession. Through the victory of Zeus and his allies, the universe passes from primal chaos to a stable hierarchy governed by law and deliberation. The establishment of Zeus's kingship symbolizes the triumph of order over instinct, a moral and cosmological shift from elemental struggle to divine jurisprudence. Hesiod's Zeus differs markedly from the warrior kings of Homeric epic. Though powerful and often punitive, he embodies the principle of justice. His authority derives not solely from force but from the maintenance of balance among divine and mortal realms. The theogony thus reflects the transition of Greek religion from localized cults to a unified moral framework. The gods acquire defined genealogies and domains. Poseidon rules the sea, Hades the underworld, Hera the sphere of marriage, and Athena the realm of wisdom and craft. Each deity becomes both a personified force of nature and a component of the cosmic order under Zeus's sovereignty. The poem also delineates the origins of other mythic beings, the Muses, Graces, and Fates, whose functions regulate creativity, beauty, and destiny. Hesiod introduces them at the beginning of the poem as sources of poetic inspiration, linking divine truth to human knowledge. The Muses of Mount Helicon grant the poet the power to speak true things, aletheia, making the theogony not merely a cosmogony but also a theological charter for poetic authority. The poet becomes mediator between divine order and human understanding, articulating cosmic truth through measured verse. From a historical perspective, Hesiod's organization of the divine hierarchy reflects the social and political consolidation of the early Greek world. The 8th and 7th centuries BC witnessed the emergence of the polis, the city-state, and with it, the concept of structured governance. Zeus's rule over the gods parallels the formation of civic order among mortals. Assemblies, councils, and codified laws replacing hereditary kingship. Hesiod's theology thus mirrors the intellectual climate of his time, a movement toward rationalization, categorization, and systemic thought. The divine family becomes an allegory for the ordered community, where each member fulfills a prescribed role within an overarching law. The theogony also reveals an early Greek effort to reconcile myth with observation. The genealogical model reflects natural processes of generation and succession. Mountains, rivers, winds, and stars are born from divine unions, personifying the regularity of the natural world. This systemized mythic ecology provided a framework for understanding the cosmos long before philosophy emerged. Later thinkers, from Heraclitus to Plato, would draw upon Hesiod's conceptual structure, the idea that order evolves from conflict and that moral harmony mirrors cosmic stability. Archaeological and textual parallels reinforce the poem's cross-cultural depth. Cylinder seals from Ugarit and reliefs from Anatolia depict divine assemblies and succession myths analogous to Hesiod's narrative. These visual and literary correspondences indicate that Greek theology evolved through sustained contact with Near Eastern traditions. Yet Hesiod's adaptation is distinctly Hellenic in its moral orientation. Divine conflict resolves into lawful governance, reflecting a belief in reason's capacity to impose structure upon chaos. By the conclusion of the theogony, Zeus has established his dominion over gods and men. The cosmos stands ordered, heaven above, earth below, Tartarus beneath. Each deity occupies a defined place, and the moral principle of balance governs the whole. For the first time in Greek thought, the universe is presented as a system rather than a collection of narratives. Hesiod's achievement lies in transforming myth into metaphysics, not through abstraction, but through lineage and law. This synthesis would become the foundation of later Greek religion and philosophy. The poets, sculptors, and dramatists of the classical age inherited from Hesiod a structured pantheon, an ethical cosmos, and a model for divine authority rooted in justice. From this system emerged countless local adaptations, each shaping the gods in its own likeness. Every city-state carved its gods in its own image. Following the theological synthesis of Hesiod, Greek religion did not crystallize into a centralized orthodoxy. Instead, it diversified into a mosaic of local cults, each polis shaping divine character to mirror its civic ideals and environment. Religion in Greece was not codified by scripture or priesthood, but embedded within the life of the community. In festivals, sacrifices, and dedications that tied civic identity to divine patronage. This decentralization produced a system of extraordinary variety, where Athena in Athens differed fundamentally from Artemis in Ephesus or Apollo in Delphi, despite sharing mythic ancestry. The evidence of temples, inscriptions, and votive offerings demonstrates that Greek religion was defined less by doctrine than by geography, politics, and custom. In Athens, the cult of Athena Polias illustrates the integration of divine worship with civic governance. Archaeological layers on the Acropolis reveal continuous ritual activity from the Mycenaean period through the Classical era, centered on the veneration of a wooden image, Zoanon, believed to have fallen from heaven. The Panathenaic festival, celebrated every 4 years, united all Athenian citizens in a procession culminating in the presentation of a new robe to the goddess. Inscriptions record the involvement of magistrates, artisans, and medics, reflecting a religion of citizenship rather than priestly mediation. Athena's character, rational, disciplined, and protective, corresponded to Athenian ideals of deliberation and civic order. Through her cult, the city projected an image of divine intelligence guiding collective decision, an implicit theology of democracy grounded in reason and restraint. By contrast, in Sparta, the religious landscape emphasized endurance, discipline, and martial devotion. The cults of Artemis Orthia and Apollo Karnios reveal a focus on communal strength and ritualized hardship. Excavations at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, near the Eurotas River, uncovered thousands of lead votive figurines, many depicting warriors and animals. Literary sources, notably Pausanias, describe ceremonies in which Spartan youths endured flogging before the goddess's altar, a rite symbolizing submission to divine and civic law. The Spartan pantheon thus reflected a society governed by austerity and obedience, where religion reinforced collective discipline rather than individual salvation. The sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi demonstrates how local cults could transcend geography to become pan-Hellenic centers of identity. Situated on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, Delphi's oracle served as a unifying institution for the Greek world from the 8th century BCE onward. Inscriptions preserved on the Athenian treasury and Delphic temple walls record dedications from city-states across the Aegean. Apollo's dual character, as god of prophecy and measure, symbolized both divine insight and civic order. The Pythian Games, held in his honor, gathered communities in peaceful competition, reinforcing shared cultural values through ritual and spectacle. Delphi thus functioned as both sacred site and diplomatic forum, where religion mediated alliances, colonization decrees, and political consultation. The oracle's authority gave religious sanction to the evolving network of Greek polis. In Ephesus, on the Ionian coast of Asia Minor, the cult of Artemis Ephesia developed an iconography distinct from her mainland form. Excavations at the Artemis Ion reveal a monumental temple, later one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, dedicated to a goddess portrayed not as a huntress but as a fertility deity, adorned with rows of symbolic breasts or eggs. This syncretic form blended Anatolian mother goddess imagery with Greek theology, reflecting the city's position as a crossroads of cultures. Inscriptions in Greek and Lydian attest to bilingual worship and priestly administration. The Ephesian Artemis thus embodied both local identity and transregional exchange, demonstrating how Greek religion absorbed and reinterpreted external influences while preserving structural continuity. Other cities exhibited similar processes of adaptation. In Corinth, Aphrodite assumed maritime and political dimensions, associated with seafaring and diplomacy. In Thebes, Dionysus was venerated as both ecstatic liberator and civic deity, linking agricultural renewal to communal cohesion. Excavated altars, terracotta figurines, and dedicatory inscriptions across the Greek mainland and islands attest to an extensive network of cult practice rooted in locality. Each polis maintained its own calendars, priesthoods, and ritual forms, yet all participated in a shared mythological framework derived from Homeric and Hesiodic traditions. Epigraphic evidence from sites such as Delos, Lindos, and Pergamon confirms the administrative complexity of these cults. Temple accounts inscribed on stone record expenditures for sacrifices, maintenance of sacred precincts, and inventories of votive offerings. These records reveal religion as a mechanism of civic economy and governance. Priests and priestesses often served for limited terms, selected by lot or election, underscoring the integration of sacred duties into the political system. The gods, in turn, legitimized civic authority. Decrees and treaties were frequently inscribed under the protection of Zeus, Athena, or Apollo, binding human contracts within divine oversight. The diversity of cult practice extended to ritual form and spatial design. Temples varied in architecture according to regional resources and aesthetics. The Doric style of the Peloponnese contrasted with the Ionic elegance of Ionia and the Aeolic variants of northern Greece. Offerings, too, reflected local economy: olive oil in Attica, bronze in Laconia, grain in Sicily. Archaeological studies of sanctuaries such as Nicoria and Lefkandi show continuity in ritual deposition from the Dark Age into the Archaic period, indicating that while myth evolved, the social function of worship, affirming community and hierarchy, remained constant. Taken together, the evidence portrays Greek religion as a decentralized yet integrated system, a federation of cults bound by shared mythic vocabulary and ritual logic. The absence of centralized theology allowed adaptability. Each community could express its distinct character through divine representation without severing its cultural kinship with the broader Hellenic world. Civic identity shaped divinity, and divinity in turn legitimized civic identity. Yet, even amid this regional diversity, the Greeks maintained a growing sense of common religious heritage. Shared myths, common language, and mutual recognition of sanctuaries provided the framework for what later writers would call Hellenismus, the collective identity of the Greeks. Through the convergence of art, poetry, and pilgrimage, local gods became part of a wider sacred geography. Yet through shared festivals and art, the Greeks would build a collective religious identity. On Mount Olympus, Greece found unity beyond its quarreling cities. By the late 8th and 7th centuries BCE, as the network of city-states expanded across the Aegean, a shared religious framework began to crystallize. Out of diverse local cults emerged a structured pantheon, the 12 Olympians, forming the symbolic center of Hellenic spirituality. This development was neither imposed by decree nor codified by any priesthood. Rather, it evolved organically from the convergence of poetry, ritual, and art, uniting disparate communities through a common divine genealogy. The gods of Olympus became a mirror for the Greek world itself. Independent, competitive, and yet bound together by kinship and order. Archaeological and literary evidence situates this consolidation in the sanctuaries of Olympia and Delphi, where regional worship intersected to form pan-Hellenic institutions. At Olympia, excavations reveal continuous ritual activity from the 10th century BCE, long before the classical games. The sanctuary's earliest altars were dedicated not to Zeus alone but to multiple deities, Hera, Poseidon, and the personified river Alpheus among them. Over time, however, Zeus Olympios assumed primacy, his cult symbolizing authority and divine justice. The Olympic Games, first held in 776 BCE according to later chronographers, became both athletic and sacred festivals. Inscriptions recording victors and dedications reflect the gradual fusion of competition with piety, a celebration of human excellence under divine patronage. The ritual unity at Olympia provided a counterbalance to Greece's endemic political divisions. While polis contended for power, they recognized a shared religious center that transcended rivalry. At Delphi, the oracle of Apollo Pythios fulfilled a similar integrative role. Pilgrims and emissaries from across the Hellenic world sought guidance from the Pythia, whose pronouncements, recorded by priests and inscribed on temple walls, shaped colonization, diplomacy, and warfare. The sanctuaries' treasuries, built by rival states such as Athens and Sparta, stood side by side, displaying wealth within a framework of common devotion. The Amphictyonic League, an association of states responsible for maintaining the Delphic sanctuary, institutionalized cooperation in religious administration. Thus, through Apollo's oracle, religion became a mechanism of interstate communication and cultural cohesion, reinforcing shared moral and cosmological assumptions. The consolidation of the Olympian order was also a literary achievement. The Homeric hymns, composed between the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, formalized the personalities and domains of the gods, offering standardized narratives recognizable across the Greek-speaking world. Each hymn begins with an invocation, "Sing, Muse of," establishing both divine lineage and sphere of influence. The hymn to Demeter, for example, defines the seasonal cycle through the myth of Persephone's abduction, while the hymn to Apollo traces his birth at Delos and his establishment of the oracle at Delphi. These compositions served as liturgical foundations for festivals, ensuring that local cults were framed within a shared mythological structure. In doing so, they extended the reach of Hesiod's theological order from poetic abstraction into public ritual practice. Material culture reinforces this literary evidence. The iconography of the 12 Olympians appears consistently in vase painting, temple sculpture, and dedicatory reliefs from the 6th century BCE onward. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Demeter, Aphrodite, Ares, Hephaestus, Hermes, and either Hestia or Dionysus, though the roster varied regionally, were depicted as a cohesive divine assembly. At sites like the altar of Zeus at Olympia and the Parthenon in Athens, the Olympians appear not as abstract forces but as anthropomorphic figures engaged in recognizable social order. Their interactions reflected the Greek conception of the cosmos as a community governed by balance and reciprocity. The visual consistency of these representations across the Greek world reveals a degree of theological standardization unprecedented in earlier centuries. Yet, this unification did not erase diversity. Each polis continued to emphasize particular deities, but all recognized the Olympian hierarchy as the shared framework of divine authority. The political fragmentation of the Greek world, with hundreds of autonomous city-states, made religious unity even more vital. Sanctuaries at Delos, Isthmia, and Nemea hosted festivals similar to Olympia's, creating regular occasions for peaceful assembly and reaffirming collective identity. Participation in these gatherings came to define what it meant to be Greek, distinguishing Hellenes from the Barbaroi beyond the Aegean. Religion thus functioned as cultural diplomacy, a system of symbols and rituals that enabled coexistence amid constant competition. Epigraphic sources attest to the formalization of shared cult practice. Dedications inscribed to the gods of Olympus appear in temple inventories and decrees, signifying recognition of a collective divine order. Hymns and oaths invoked the Olympians as guarantors of treaties, embedding religion within the fabric of interstate relations. The Delphic maxims, attributed to Apollo and inscribed at the temple entrance, "Know thyself, nothing in excess," encapsulated moral ideals that transcended local politics, expressing a pan-Hellenic ethical vision rooted in moderation and self-knowledge. The rise of Panhellenism was therefore both a religious and cultural process. Through shared sanctuaries, festivals, and literary canon, the Greeks articulated unity without political centralization. The Olympian system provided a symbolic constitution, a divine reflection of the human polis, where independent entities coexisted under a common order. The pantheon's hierarchical yet familial structure offered a model for understanding conflict and cooperation among cities. Zeus's rule over the gods mirrored the Greek aspiration for harmony amid autonomy. By the 6th century BCE, the Olympian order had become the spiritual architecture of the Greek world. Its myths governed ritual life, its imagery adorned public spaces, and its moral principles informed education and law. Through the worship of the 12, the Greeks found coherence in diversity, a shared vision of cosmos and community that bound the scattered cities of the Aegean into a single cultural civilization. But even as faith unified, thought began to question. When Thales sought water as the source of all things, he drained the cosmos of myth. In the 6th century BCE, along the Ionian coast of Asia Minor, a new mode of thought emerged, one that sought to understand the world not through divine genealogy, but through observation, reason, and inference. The city of Miletus, a prosperous maritime hub with colonies and trading posts stretching from the Black Sea to Egypt, became the cradle of this intellectual revolution. Its exposure to diverse cultures and cosmologies, Babylonian astronomy, Egyptian geometry, and Anatolian religion, provided fertile ground for speculation about nature's underlying principles. From this environment arose the Milesian school, whose thinkers replaced mythic narrative with rational explanation, initiating what later historians would call the birth of philosophy. Thales of Miletus, regarded by Aristotle as the first philosopher, is said to have proposed that water was the arche, the fundamental substance of the cosmos. To modern ears, this may sound simplistic, but its significance lies in method rather than conclusion. By positing a single, observable element as the basis of all things, Thales introduced a naturalistic framework that dispensed with divine causation. According to later testimony in Aristotle's Metaphysics, 983 b. 20, Thales derived his theory from empirical observation, the ubiquity of moisture in life and transformation. In identifying continuity between the human, the terrestrial, and the cosmic, he replaced the genealogical logic of Hesiod's theogony with a unifying principle governed by nature itself. For the first time, the order of the universe could be studied as a system rather than narrated as a story of gods. His successor, Anaximander, expanded this inquiry beyond material substance to abstraction. In fragments preserved by Simplicius, he described the origin of all things from the apeiron, the boundless or infinite. Unlike Thales' tangible element, the apeiron was an indefinite principle encompassing all opposites: hot and cold, wet and dry, light and dark. From it, he argued, the cosmos emerges through a process of separation and balance. Anaximander's conception marked a decisive departure from mythic imagery. Where Hesiod had personified primordial forces, Chaos, Gaia, Eros, Anaximander reduced them to impersonal interactions governed by necessity, kata to krein. His surviving fragment reads, "Whence things have their origin, thence also their destruction happens, according to necessity. For they give justice and reparation to one another for their injustice according to the ordering of time." The language evokes moral imagery, yet the meaning is physical, a law of equilibrium within nature itself. This abstraction introduced the first notion of cosmic law, an order independent of divine will. Anaximander also pioneered early cosmology and biology, proposing that the Earth floats unsupported in space and that humans evolved from aquatic creatures, ideas strikingly distinct from mythological cosmogony. The Milesians thus shifted focus from divine agency to natural process, transforming wonder, the uma, into inquiry, historia. The third of the Milesian triad, Anaximenes, returned to the concept of a tangible arche, proposing that air is the underlying principle. He explained diversity in nature through processes of rarefaction and condensation. Air becoming fire when rarefied, and wind, cloud, water, and earth as it condenses. This model introduced a rudimentary notion of transformation through measurable change, suggesting continuity between matter and energy. The cosmos, he argued, breathes as we do. Air sustains both the world and life. Anaximenes' analogy between microcosm and macrocosm reflected a rationalized spirituality, a universe still sacred, but sacred through order, not myth. Collectively, these thinkers replaced the genealogical cosmology of Hesiod and the anthropomorphic theology of Homer with a universe governed by principle and process. The transition was gradual rather than oppositional. Early philosophers retained mythic language, the justice of the elements, the breath of the cosmos, yet transformed its function from narrative to explanation. In doing so, they initiated a dual legacy: the demythologization of nature and the rationalization of wonder. Their writings, fragmentary yet foundational, established the intellectual vocabulary that later philosophers, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, and the atomists, would refine. Archaeological and textual evidence situates this intellectual movement within the socio-political context of Ionian prosperity and instability. The 6th century BCE was marked by colonial expansion, maritime trade, and exposure to Eastern knowledge systems. Miletus itself suffered repeated conquests, from Lydian to Persian control, fostering an awareness of impermanence and change. This environment encouraged speculation detached from civic religion, a search for constance amid flux. Inscriptions from nearby sanctuaries, such as Didyma, indicate continued devotion to Apollo, but philosophical inquiry increasingly occupied a separate intellectual sphere. Knowledge was no longer confined to the temple but pursued in open discourse. The Ionian thinkers did not reject the divine outright. Rather, they redefined it. For Thales, the world was full of gods, meaning not anthropomorphic beings, but immanent forces pervading all things. Divinity was naturalized, a property of order itself. This reinterpretation marked the beginning of physis, the study of nature as an autonomous reality. Myth persisted, but as metaphor, its literal claims yielding to explanatory models. The cosmos, once born of chaos and ruled by Zeus, now obeyed principles discoverable by reason. This intellectual transformation did not eliminate religion. It created a dialogue between belief and knowledge that would characterize Greek thought for centuries. The Milesians established that explanation need not exclude reverence, that understanding the world could itself be an act of piety. Yet their approach shifted authority from revelation to observation, from the poets to the thinkers. By the end of the 6th century BCE, the Ionian experiment had redefined inquiry itself. To question the origins of the cosmos without invoking divine ancestry was to inaugurate a new intellectual age. The Greek mind, once shaped by mythic imagination, now turned toward the logic of nature, a movement that would echo from Miletus to Athens, from science to philosophy. Yet poets would reclaim the divine, not in temples but on the stage. In Athens, the theater became the new temple of myth. During the 5th century BCE, as the Greek polis reached its cultural and political maturity, myth found a new form, not in epic poetry or ritual hymn, but in drama. The rise of tragedy in Athens transformed inherited legends into instruments of civic reflection. What had once been sung by bards or recited in sanctuaries was now performed before thousands of citizens in the theater of Dionysus, at the foot of the Acropolis. Here, amid festivals such as the City Dionysia, playwrights reinterpreted divine and heroic stories in the light of human ethics, law, and responsibility. The stage became a forum where theological ideas met political consciousness, and myth evolved from sacred narrative into philosophical inquiry. The origins of tragedy lie in the dithyramb, a choral hymn to Dionysus that celebrated transformation and ecstasy. By the early 5th century, this ritual had matured into a complex art form blending music, poetry, and performance. The earliest known tragedian, Aeschylus, c. 525 to 456 BCE, expanded this form into moral drama. His plays preserved the grandeur of divine justice while framing it within the polis emerging ideals of order and law. In the Orestia trilogy, Aeschylus depicts the transformation of vengeance into justice, the passage from blood feud to civic trial. The gods themselves evolve. Athena intervenes not to punish but to establish the Areopagus, Athens' court of law. The trilogy ends with the Furies, once terrifying agents of retribution, pacified into protectors of the state. Through myth, Aeschylus articulated a theological justification for human institutions. The divine order, once arbitrary, was now moral and procedural, a cosmos reflected in the courtroom. Aeschylus' vision retained a reverent tone. His Zeus, though distant, embodied moral necessity, Dike, a principle harmonizing human suffering with cosmic balance. This conception echoed earlier thinkers such as Anaximander, who had described nature's equilibrium as justice among things. Tragedy thus became a medium through which philosophical ideas were dramatized rather than expounded. The chorus, representing collective wisdom, commented on events with reflective detachment, linking personal guilt to universal law. The experience of watching tragedy, shared by citizens of all classes, functioned as a form of communal ethics, shaping Athenian moral consciousness through emotion and reason combined. Sophocles, c. 496 to 406 BCE, refined tragedy's structure and deepened its psychological scope. His Oedipus Tyrannus examines the interplay of knowledge, fate, and human limitation. In this drama, divine prophecy is not an arbitrary curse but a framework exposing the boundaries of human understanding. Oedipus' downfall lies not in impiety, but in the tragic conflict between autonomy and inevitability. The Delphic oracle's pronouncement, that Oedipus will kill his father and marry his mother, becomes a mirror for the Greek tension between rational inquiry and divine mystery. As the plague devastates Thebes, Oedipus' investigation into its cause reflects the same spirit of inquiry that animated the philosophers of Ionia, yet his search ends in revelation rather than comprehension. Sophocles thus bridges myth and reason. Knowledge remains sacred, but human capacity to wield it is finite. Sophocles' portrayal of divinity also reflects the ethos of the polis. His Antigone dramatizes the conflict between civic authority and moral law. When Creon forbids the burial of Polynices, Antigone invokes the unwritten laws of the gods, asserting the supremacy of eternal justice over temporal decree. The play does not resolve the tension but exposes its necessity. Both divine and civic laws are indispensable, yet irreconcilable. In dramatizing such conflicts, Sophocles elevated myth to an ethical discourse central to democratic life. His tragedies were not mere retellings of legend but public debates on the limits of human governance and the permanence of moral truth. With Euripides, c. 480 to 406 BCE, tragedy turned inward, reflecting the intellectual skepticism of late 5th century Athens. Influenced by the sophists and the shifting values of a city at war, Euripides treated the gods not as moral absolutes but as characters within human drama. In the Bacchae, Dionysus embodies both divine power and psychological complexity, a god demanding recognition of the irrational forces within civilization. The play's destruction of Pentheus, the rational ruler who denies Dionysus' divinity, illustrates the peril of suppressing emotion and instinct. Yet Euripides also exposes the cruelty of divine vengeance, questioning whether justice lies in submission or resistance. In Medea, a mortal woman defies divine and social order alike, her act of infanticide simultaneously condemned and understood. The gods in Euripides' world no longer embody harmony. They mirror the moral ambiguity of human existence. Euripides' realism reflects broader intellectual trends. The rise of sophistic rhetoric and natural philosophy encouraged debate over the nature of divinity, virtue, and fate. Tragedy became a space for these debates, its mythic framework allowing exploration of ideas too contentious for political assembly. Inscriptions from the city Dionysia reveal the civic sponsorship of plays, a reminder that these dramas were not private entertainments but public rituals of reflection. Citizens watched, judged, and voted on performances that interpreted their own laws and beliefs through ancient legend. The result was a uniquely Greek synthesis of art, religion, and politics, theology staged as civic dialogue. Archaeological remains of theaters across the Greek world, at Epidaurus, Delphi, Syracuse, and Pergamon, attest to the diffusion of this dramatic form. Each structure, designed with precise acoustics and monumental scale, functioned as both civic space and sacred precinct. Dedications to Dionysus, found inscribed on theater foundations, reaffirmed the link between artistic expression and divine patronage. The chorus, dancing in the circular orchestra, symbolized collective humanity before the gods. The stage, elevated above it, became the realm of fate and action, a physical representation of the tension between mortal and divine. Tragedy's evolution from ritual to art reflects the intellectual trajectory of classical Greece itself, from mythic worldview to ethical reasoning. Where Hesiod's cosmos was ruled by genealogical order and Homer's by heroic virtue, the tragedian's world was governed by moral law and human choice. Fate persisted, but its meaning shifted, from arbitrary divine decree to structural necessity. The gods remained present, but their presence demanded interpretation, not obedience. Through tragedy, the Greeks learned to question myth without discarding it, to find moral clarity in ambiguity. By the end of the 5th century BCE, tragedy had become the moral conscience of Athens. Its language of justice, balance, and transgression echoed in the courts, assemblies, and philosophical schools that followed. The gods, once feared or adored, had become subjects of reflection, their myths repurposed as instruments of reason. Through the theater, Athens reimagined divinity for the age of the polis, transforming myth from revelation into inquiry. As drama humanized the gods, historians began to demystify them. By the 5th century BCE, even the immortals faced inquiry. As Greek thought matured, the authority of myth encountered a new challenge: history itself. What had once been taken as divine revelation was now subjected to verification, chronology, and human causality. The emergence of historiography in the 5th century BCE signaled a profound shift, from sacred narrative to critical narrative, from divine agency to human responsibility. The gods did not vanish from the Greek imagination, but they began to lose their monopoly on explanation. In their place rose a new pantheon, the historians, whose reverence was for truth, evidence, and reason. The earliest and most literary of these was Herodotus of Halicarnassus, c. 484 to 425 BCE, whom Cicero would later call the father of history. His histories begins not with myth but with a question: the causes of the wars between Greeks and Persians. Yet Herodotus' curiosity extends backward into legend. He recounts tales of divine encounters, oracles, and miracles, but his tone is one of distance rather than devotion. "I must tell what is said," he writes, "though I am not bound to believe it." This cautious formula captures the spirit of rational criticism emerging in his age. The historian preserves myth as cultural memory while evaluating it through inquiry. Herodotus still lived in a world where gods were plausible actors. His narratives include dreams that foretell battles and omens that alter fates. Yet beneath these stories lies a new moral logic, the belief that hubris, excessive pride, brings downfall not because the gods are offended, but because it violates the natural balance of things. In Herodotus' world, divine justice mirrors historical necessity. The downfall of Croesus, the Persian invasions, and the shifting fortunes of empires all illustrate a moral law that no longer requires divine intervention. The historian thus stands at a threshold between mythic causation and rational analysis, preserving the language of the sacred while emptying it of its supernatural weight. With Thucydides, c. 460 to 400 BCE, that threshold was decisively crossed. In his History of the Peloponnesian War, there are no gods at all, only men, politics, and power. The speeches he records, whether verbatim or reconstructed, form the first sustained examination of human motivation in a world governed by necessity. As for the acts of the gods, Thucydides declares, "I have not thought it proper to record them, since their truth cannot be established." This was not impiety but method, a conscious rejection of myth as a mode of explanation. The world of Thucydides operates by laws of psychology and strategy, not divine will. The plague of Athens, which Herodotus might have attributed to Apollo's wrath, becomes for Thucydides a natural phenomenon observed with clinical detachment. This transformation in outlook had philosophical roots. The sophists and early rationalists had already begun to reinterpret traditional stories as allegory or moral parable. Protagoras' claim that man is the measure of all things resonated in the historian's craft. Truth was no longer a divine possession but a human pursuit. Myth became, in this sense, data, evidence of how societies once explained their world. The historian replaced the priest as interpreter of the past. The process of demythologization reached a radical form in the theories of Euhemerus, late 4th century BCE, whose lost work Sacred History survives in fragments. Euhemerus proposed that the gods had once been great kings, heroes, or benefactors, later exalted to divine status through memory and worship. Zeus, he claimed, was an ancient ruler of Crete, Aphrodite, a deified queen. This euhemeristic interpretation sought to humanize the divine entirely, converting theology into anthropology. It was a striking intellectual inversion. Where Homer had made gods behave like men, Euhemerus made men into gods. Though later writers like Diodorus Siculus and Cicero preserved his ideas, Euhemerus' influence extended far beyond the Hellenistic world. Early Christian thinkers would later adopt his logic to argue that pagan gods were not divine beings but mortal impostors, a rhetorical weapon against polytheism. Yet, in its original form, Euhemerism was not hostility to religion, but an effort to historicize belief, to trace the evolution of worship from gratitude to legend. It reflected the same rational impulse that drove Herodotus to test testimony and Thucydides to measure power, the conviction that truth must be humanly intelligible. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence supports this intellectual shift. Inscriptions from the classical and Hellenistic periods reveal growing attention to genealogy, chronology, and geography, as civic record-keeping replaced oral tradition. Temple dedications began to include dates and civic attributions, suggesting an increasing interest in factual precision. Even in art, the gods became more human. The serene rationality of 5th-century sculpture, exemplified in the Parthenon marbles, replaced the supernatural awe of archaic forms. The divine was aestheticized, rationalized, and domesticated within the order of reason. Yet rational criticism did not destroy Greek religion. Rather, it transformed its meaning. The gods became metaphors for human experience, for justice, love, chaos, and order. Philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle would inherit this reinterpretation, seeking a divine principle consistent with reason, the form of the good, the unmoved mover. In their hands, myth became philosophy's language of analogy, a poetic means to express what reason alone could not define. By the end of the classical age, myth had passed through its crucible. From Homer's epic storytelling to Hesiod's theology, from tragedy's moral questioning to history's rational scrutiny, the Greek mind had subjected its gods to every test of logic and art. The result was not disbelief, but transformation. The divine reimagined as metaphor, principle, and symbol. In questioning the immortals, the Greeks immortalized reason itself. And in the ruins of war and empire, religion would evolve again. To be Greek was to worship publicly, belief was a civic act. Religion in classical Greece was not a matter of private faith but a framework for communal order. Every polis expressed its identity through ritual, and every ritual affirmed the unity of its people before the gods. Worship was both duty and declaration, a performance of belonging that connected the citizen to the divine, the family to the city, and the city to the cosmos. Archaeological, literary, and epigraphic evidence from sanctuaries such as Delphi, Olympia, and Eleusis reveals a world where religion was woven into every layer of civic life, from the household hearth to the Pan-Hellenic festival. At the center of Greek ritual stood sacrifice, the defining act of piety. Inscriptions and reliefs depict the preparation, procession, and offering with striking uniformity. The animal, often a goat, sheep, or ox, was led to the altar, crowned with garlands, and sprinkled with barley grains. A libation of wine consecrated the moment before the priest's knife drew the first blood. The animal's throat was cut, and its thigh bones, wrapped in fat, were burned as the god's portion, while the remaining meat was cooked and shared among the participants. This dual character, gift and feast, illustrates the Greek conception of reciprocity between mortals and deities. As the smoke rose heavenward, the polis reaffirmed its bond with the divine order. The importance of sacrifice extended beyond temples to civic festivals, which synchronized the religious and political calendars of each city-state. In Athens, The Panathenea celebrated Athena's patronage through athletic contests, musical performances, and a grand procession culminating in the presentation of a new woven robe, peplos, to her statue on the Acropolis. In Olympia, the festival of Zeus united competing polis in peaceful contest, demonstrating religion's role as a mediator amid constant rivalry. In Delphi, the Pythian Games combined artistic and athletic achievement under the gaze of Apollo's oracle. These festivals were more than religious events. They were instruments of diplomacy, venues for trade, and expressions of cultural unity, religion functioning as the social grammar of the Greek world. Beyond public temples, piety began at home. The domestic shrine, often centered around the hearth, honored Hestia, goddess of the household fire. Offerings of wine or grain marked daily life transitions, birth, marriage, departure, and return. The oikos thus mirrored the polis, order within reflected order without. Even personal rituals, such as prayers before journeys or small votive dedications, were not acts of solitary devotion but extensions of a collective worldview in which the divine permeated every sphere of existence. Archaeological excavations at Olympus and Delos reveal household altars and miniature figurines of deities, suggesting that the sacred was not confined to grand sanctuaries but integrated into domestic rhythms. The Greeks did not worship in silence. Hymns, processions, and dances accompanied nearly every ritual act. Inscriptions record payments to choral leaders and musicians, confirming the role of performance in expressing reverence. The rhythmic movement of dance and the sound of the aulos, flute, or kithara transformed worship into spectacle, making religion a shared sensory experience. The civic priesthoods, often temporary and drawn from local elites, maintained this system. They were administrators of divine law, but their authority derived from civic appointment, not prophetic calling. Religion, therefore, remained grounded in citizenship rather than revelation. Central to Greek religious consciousness was the oracle, where divine will met human decision. Among these, Delphi held preeminence. Archaeological remains of its Temple of Apollo, inscribed with maxims such as "Know thyself" and "Nothing in excess," demonstrate the moral dimension of Greek piety. Visitors sought guidance through ritual consultation. After purification and sacrifice, the Pythia, seated over a fissure in the temple floor, delivered Apollo's response in ecstatic utterance, later interpreted by priests. Her ambiguous words, part poetry, part policy, influenced decisions of war, colonization, and law. The oracular institution thus exemplified the Greek balance between reason and divination, where even the most rational polis acknowledged the need for divine sanction. Equally significant were mystery cults, particularly at Eleusis, which offered initiates the promise of spiritual insight and renewal. Though the precise rites remain secret, literary testimonies describe processions from Athens, ritual purification, and the revelation of sacred objects within the telesterion. Unlike civic religion, which emphasized participation and order, the mysteries spoke to personal salvation and transformation, reflecting a growing diversity of religious experience within the classical world. Archaeological findings, including votive reliefs and dedications to Demeter and Persephone, confirm the cult's enduring appeal across centuries and social classes. Ritual and sacrifice also reinforced moral and political hierarchies. Priests presided, magistrates sponsored festivals, and citizens contributed to offerings. Even slaves and medics, resident foreigners, could participate, but within prescribed roles. Through ritual, society rehearsed its structure. Gods above men, men above women, citizens above outsiders. This hierarchy was not oppressive in intent but cosmological in logic, a reflection of the ordered universe described by Hesiod and mirrored in civic governance. The polis, like Olympus, was a community of roles, each bound by reciprocal obligation. Archaeological evidence underscores the centrality of these practices. Excavations at Olympia reveal vast accumulations of animal bones and ash layers from centuries of sacrifice, while at Delphi, treasuries built by city-states displayed offerings of gold, bronze, and marble, proclaiming both piety and prestige. Inscriptions detail festival calendars, priestly duties, and financial accounts, testifying to religion's integration with administration and economy. Even temple architecture, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, embodied rational proportion as an expression of divine harmony. In sum, classical Greek religion functioned as a public system of order and cohesion. Its rituals expressed gratitude and dependence, but also enacted law, identity, and continuity. Sacrifice linked human necessity with divine favor. Festivals united the polis through shared spectacle. Oracles reminded mortals of their limits before fate. This was not faith in the modern sense, but participation in a sacred order sustained by practice rather than creed. But devotion also inspired artistry that immortalized the divine form. In marble and paint, the Greeks made myth visible. In the classical world, art was not merely decoration. It was theology rendered in form. Through sculpture, painting, and pottery, the Greeks translated abstract belief into visible order. The gods, once invisible presences invoked in ritual, became tangible figures, idealized, anthropomorphic, and eternally poised. Art thus performed a dual function. It embodied divine perfection and articulated the civic values that sustained the polis. Archaeological and stylistic evidence from the 5th and 4th centuries BCE reveals how Greek artists shaped not only the appearance of their gods but the intellectual framework of religion itself. The shift from the archaic to the classical style marked a profound reimagining of the divine. The rigid choroi and chorai of the 6th century BCE, frontal, formulaic, and hieratratic, gave way to the contrapposto of early classical sculpture, where balance and movement conveyed inner vitality. The Critios boy, dated to c. 480 BCE, embodies this transition, no longer a symbolic effigy, but a breathing youth suspended between tension and repose. This innovation was not aesthetic alone but philosophical. By representing the gods and heroes through perfected human anatomy, Greek artists affirmed a worldview in which the divine was accessible through human reason and proportion. The works of Phidias, Polykleitos, and Praxiteles define this visual theology. Phidias' monumental chryselephantine statues of Athena Parthenos in Athens and Zeus at Olympia, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, represented the apogee of cultic art. Crafted from gold and ivory, these figures combined grandeur with composure, embodying both divine majesty and rational harmony. According to ancient testimonies, the statue of Zeus seated upon his throne in Olympia filled the temple so completely that it seemed to touch the heavens, a visual expression of cosmic sovereignty. The careful mathematical proportions of Polykleitos Doryphorus, spear-bearer, described in his treatise Canon, codified this aesthetic. Symmetry and balance as reflections of divine order. The body became a microcosm of the cosmos, its geometry mirroring the structure of the world itself. Temple architecture amplified this theology through stone. The Parthenon, 447 to 432 BCE, designed by Ectinus and Callicrates under Phidias' artistic direction, served not merely as a dwelling for Athena but as an allegory of order and reason. Its Doric peristyle, mathematical precision, and optical refinements, subtle curvature of columns and stylobate, demonstrated that divinity could be expressed through proportion rather than miracle. The sculptural program of its pediments and metopes illustrated mythological conflicts, gods versus giants, Greeks versus Amazons, as metaphors for the eternal struggle between civilization and chaos. The Panathenaic frieze, encircling the cella, depicted Athenians in procession, visually merging mortal devotion with divine presence. Through art, the civic and the sacred became indistinguishable. Beyond temples, myth found its most vivid narrative form on painted pottery, particularly the red figureware of the late 6th and 5th centuries BCE. These vessels, often used in domestic and symposiastic contexts, disseminated mythic imagery into daily life. Scenes of Heracles' labors, Dionysian revels, and the judgment of Paris adorned craters and kylikes, transforming ordinary objects into vehicles of mythological education. The precision of drawing, enhanced by the fluid red-on-black technique, allowed for expressive gestures and detailed anatomy. Through these images, myths circulated among citizens of every class, ensuring continuity of cultural identity beyond the monumental scale of temples. Art also functioned as didactic theology. The depiction of the gods emphasized not their transcendence but their intelligibility. Athena was portrayed in armor, symbolizing wisdom's alliance with civic defense. Apollo, serene and youthful, represented harmony and measure. Dionysus, exuberant and fluid, embodied the liberating forces of nature and emotion. Each image reinforced moral and social ideals. The sculpted perfection of the divine form became a visual language of ethical order, aligning beauty, kalos, with goodness, agathos. This union of aesthetics and virtue, later encapsulated in the phrase kalokagathia, expressed the conviction that divine and moral harmony were one. Archaeological evidence confirms the integration of art and worship. Excavations at Delphi, Delos, and Olympia have uncovered thousands of votive statues and reliefs, ranging from simple terracotta figurines to elaborate bronze masterpieces. These offerings served as acts of gratitude, testimony, and memory. Each bore the signature of devotion, an inscription naming the dedicator and deity, binding individual piety to public monumentality. The boundary between art object and sacred object was thus fluid. Beauty itself was a form of prayer. The representation of mythic scenes also evolved to reflect intellectual developments. As philosophers sought rational explanations for natural and moral order, artists reinterpreted myths through humanized expression. The tragedies of Euripides found visual counterparts in late classical sculpture, emotion, vulnerability, and psychological realism. The Aphrodite of Knidos by Praxiteles, c. 350 BCE, broke precedent by portraying the goddess nude, emphasizing sensuality as an aspect of divine nature. This was not blasphemy but revelation. The divine ideal had become fully human in form, confirming the Hellenic conviction that the mortal and immortal shared the same image. The impact of these visual conventions extended far beyond Greece. Copies of Greek statues proliferated in Hellenistic and Roman art, ensuring their theological vocabulary endured for centuries. The serene faces of classical deities became symbols of rational divinity in later philosophical and artistic traditions. In this sense, Greek art achieved what myth alone could not. It made belief permanent and portable, a visible creed carved in stone. Through sculpture, architecture, and painted pottery, classical Greece constructed a coherent iconography of the divine, one grounded in reason, proportion, and civic pride. The gods no longer appeared only in the sky or story. They stood in marble across the cityscape, witnesses to human order and aspiration. As art spread with colonies, myth became Greece's cultural ambassador. Wherever Greeks settled, Olympus followed. Between the 8th and 5th centuries BCE, the Greeks undertook one of the most extensive colonization movements of the ancient world. Driven by demographic pressure, limited arable land, and the lure of trade, seafaring communities from the Aegean founded new settlements across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. From Massalia in the west to Cyrene in North Africa and Byzantium in the east. These colonies carried more than goods and language. They carried the gods, myths, and rituals that defined Hellenic identity. Colonization thus served as both economic expansion and religious transmission, a process through which Olympus extended its dominion across seas and centuries. The earliest foundations, particularly those of Euboean and Corinthian origin, established a model of transplantation that fused politics, economy, and religion. Archaeological layers from sites such as Pithecusae, modern Ischia, and Syracuse show that new sanctuaries were among the first structures erected by settlers. These sacred spaces provided legitimacy and continuity, linking the distant colony to its metropolis through shared worship. The founding of a city was, by custom, a religious act. An oracle at Delphi or Dodona was consulted before departure, and the chosen leader, the oikistes, was later honored with hero cult after death. Religion sanctified colonization, transforming the practical act of settlement into an expression of divine will. Yet, as the Greeks encountered foreign landscapes and peoples, their religion adapted. The colonists met indigenous deities whose domains often overlapped with those of their own gods. The result was a process of syncretism, in which local and Greek divinities merged or coexisted. In Cyrene, Apollo was worshipped alongside the Libyan god Ammon, whose oracle at Siwa would later attract even Alexander the Great. In Sicily and southern Italy, Demeter and Kore found fertile new cult centers, reflecting both agricultural continuity and the influence of native fertility traditions. In the Black Sea region, Poseidon and Artemis took on maritime and chthonic attributes previously associated with local deities of the steppe and forest. These adaptations did not dilute Greek religion. Rather, they expanded its theological geography, demonstrating a flexibility that allowed Hellenism to thrive far from its homeland. Material culture confirms this process. Excavations in Naucratis, Egypt, have uncovered dedications to both Greek and Egyptian gods, including joint offerings to Aphrodite and Hathor. Inscriptions at Olbia on the northern Black Sea reveal Greek hymns carved beside indigenous motifs, suggesting cultural negotiation rather than replacement. Pottery and sculpture exported from mainland Greece depicted familiar myths: Heracles' labors, Athena's triumphs, Dionysian revels, reinforcing a common iconographic language that united settlers with their homeland. These images acted as portable theology, carrying the Olympian order into foreign sanctuaries and domestic shrines alike. Religious festivals in the colonies mirrored those of the mother cities but often acquired local significance. The Panathenaic and Dionysian traditions, exported to Sicily and Ionia, became regional celebrations integrating Greek and indigenous participants. Inscriptions from Miletus and Ephesus attest to cross-cultural participation in such events, demonstrating how religion facilitated coexistence and trade. Greek colonization thus produced not a network of identical communities, but a constellation of hybrid identities, each rooted in local geography, yet bound by shared mythic structure. The oracles that guided colonization also reinforced this unity. Delphi, in particular, played a central role in legitimizing new foundations. Colonists interpreted the gods' ambiguous pronouncements as mandates for divine destiny, establishing a spiritual link between the homeland and the frontier. The dedications sent back to Delphi by successful colonies, bronze tripods, inscriptions, and treasuries, served as both tribute and testimony. Material evidence of the gods reach across the Mediterranean. Through such exchanges, colonization became a sacred dialogue between center and periphery, mediated by Apollo's voice. The diffusion of Greek myth through colonization also had profound intellectual effects. As Greek settlers encountered older civilizations, Egyptian, Phoenician, Anatolian, they absorbed elements of foreign cosmology and iconography. The Greek understanding of Zeus Ammon, for instance, reflects Egyptian influence. Similarly, depictions of Aphrodite absorbed features of the Phoenician Astarte. These encounters enriched the Greek pantheon, introducing new attributes and rituals that blurred the line between domestic and imported tradition. Myth became a medium of exchange, carrying ideas of divinity, morality, and nature across cultural boundaries. Colonization also spread the Greek language, which in turn standardized the telling of myths. As settlers communicated through dialectal Greek, oral traditions gained consistency, ensuring that Homeric and Hesiotic frameworks became the common heritage of the Hellenic world. The same myths that once defined a small Aegean people now united a vast maritime network of cities. In this sense, colonization created the conditions for Panhellenism, the shared identity that transcended political fragmentation through common religion, language, and story. By the 5th century BCE, the Mediterranean had become a Greek religious map. Temples to Poseidon marked coastal promontories from Spain to the Levant. Sanctuaries of Apollo and Athena crowned new urban centers. Local cults bore Greek inscriptions. The reach of Olympus was no longer confined to myth. It had become a geographical reality, mapped in marble and ritual. Colonization had achieved what art and epic had begun: the translation of belief into space. Greek religion's expansion through colonization thus represents more than diffusion. It reflects an evolving synthesis between local adaptation and cultural continuity. Wherever the Greeks sailed, they built sanctuaries, invoked the familiar gods, and absorbed new ones. In doing so, they transformed their mythology from a regional tradition into a civilizational framework, one capable of surviving conquest, translation, and time. This cultural web would soon expand under a single conqueror. Alexander saw himself not as man or god, but as their meeting point. By the 4th century BCE, Greek myth and religion had already traversed the Mediterranean through colonization, commerce, and culture. Yet it was the conquests of Alexander of Macedon, 356 to 323 BCE, that transformed Greek religion into an imperial instrument, extending its reach across 3 continents. Alexander's campaigns did not merely spread Hellenic language, art, and governance. They carried myth, ritual, and divine symbolism into the heart of Egypt, Persia, and the Indus Valley. The king's self-fashioning as a semi-divine figure merged political authority with religious ideology, creating a new model of sacral kingship whose visual and literary traces endure in both historical and archaeological records. From the outset, Alexander cultivated a mythic persona. Born to Philip II and Olympias, he claimed descent from Heracles through the Argead dynasty and, according to some sources, from Achilles via his maternal lineage. These claims were not incidental. They linked him to a lineage of heroic and divine figures celebrated in Homer and Hesiod. By emphasizing these ancestral connections, Alexander positioned himself as both heir and embodiment of Greek myth, a living intersection of human ambition and divine favor. Ancient historians, notably Arrian and Plutarch, record that Alexander publicly visited shrines, consulted oracles, and performed sacrifices with meticulous attention to ritual, blending traditional piety with political theater. The fusion of myth and authority reached its apex during Alexander's conquest of Egypt. In Memphis, the priesthood recognized him as the son of Ammonius, equating him with Zeus Ammon, a deity already syncretized from Greek and Egyptian traditions. Coinage and reliefs from this period depict Alexander wearing the horned crown of Ammon, visually signaling both divine endorsement and sovereign supremacy. These images were not passive portraits. They were active propaganda, asserting his cosmic mandate and legitimizing rule over newly conquered territories. Art, coinage, and inscriptions broadcast his semi-divine status, making religious imagery a tool of governance as well as devotion. Alexander's use of divine symbolism was complemented by a sophisticated engagement with Greek mythology itself. He invoked Heracles and Achilles not only to inspire his troops but also to frame his campaigns as continuation of legendary quests. Cities he founded, Alexandria in Egypt, Alexandria Escate in Central Asia, were often associated with particular gods, temples, and ritual calendars. Through these acts, Greek religious forms were implanted in local contexts, creating syncretic civic cults that combined Macedonian, Greek, and indigenous elements. Inscriptions and archaeological remains from Alexandria reveal dedications to Zeus, Athena, and Serapis, the latter a Hellenistic deity blending Egyptian and Greek attributes. The visual and ritual culture of Alexander's empire thus reflected a deliberate strategy. Religion became both unifier and legitimizer, binding diverse populations under a shared symbolic framework. Literary accounts emphasize the performative dimension of Alexander's divinity. According to Plutarch, he encouraged worship in temples and accepted cult honors in cities across Asia Minor and Persia. At Susa, he married Roxana, integrating local dynastic legitimacy with Greek heroic imagery. Soldiers and citizens were reminded that their king was the living nexus of myth and reality. By merging narrative, ritual, and governance, Alexander transformed Greek mythology into imperial ideology, where gods endorsed conquest and conquest reinforced the gods. Art and coinage served as primary mediums for this message. Statues depicting Alexander with divine attributes, the lion's mane of Heracles, the youthful radiance of Apollo, circulated throughout the empire. Coins minted in newly founded cities bore his portrait alongside symbols of divinity: thunderbolts, laurel wreaths, or horned crowns. The iconography standardized a visual language. Wherever one saw Alexander, one recognized the ruler as both human and divine. In effect, Greek religious ideas became inseparable from political authority, blending civic, military, and theological discourse. The theological innovation of Alexander's kingship also influenced his successors, the Diadochi, who maintained the semi-divine status of rulers in Egypt, Syria, and the Hellenistic East. Ptolemaic pharaohs adopted cultic practices honoring the monarch as god on earth, while Seleucid kings incorporated Greek deities into local traditions to legitimize dominion over diverse populations. Alexander thus inaugurated a new model of rulership, where myth and religion reinforced imperial cohesion. Despite his extraordinary achievements, Alexander's divinization also reflected Greek intellectual currents. Rational and artistic traditions had long humanized, systematized, and visualized the divine. Alexander simply politicized these developments. By combining heroic ancestry, cultic recognition, and monumental iconography, he enacted a living synthesis of myth and history, a fusion that reinforced loyalty and inspired devotion across cultures unfamiliar with Greek custom. By the time of his death in 323 BCE, Alexander's campaigns had spread Hellenic religion from the Aegean to the Indus, establishing networks of sanctuaries, festivals, and cultic imagery that would endure for centuries. The king himself became a mythic figure, his deeds recounted alongside those of heroes and gods, bridging narrative and history. Through Alexander, Greek religion evolved from a civic and regional phenomenon into a transcontinental framework, capable of shaping political, artistic, and spiritual life across multiple continents. His empire would spread Greek divinity across 3 continents. In the Hellenistic age, the gods of Greece learned foreign tongues. Following Alexander's conquests, the Greek world entered a period of unprecedented cultural and religious fusion. The Hellenistic kingdoms, particularly in Alexandria, Antioch, and Pergamon, became laboratories of syncretism, where Greek deities merged with local gods, rituals were adapted to diverse populations, and mystery cults flourished alongside traditional civic worship. This era transformed Hellenic religion from a predominantly polis-centered practice into a cosmopolitan system capable of spanning continents, reflecting both political pragmatism and spiritual innovation. Alexandria, founded by Alexander in 331 BCE, exemplifies this transformation. As a new capital of the Ptolemaic dynasty, it integrated Egyptian, Greek, and Levantine religious traditions. Central to this synthesis was the creation of Serapis, a composite deity combining aspects of Greek Zeus and Hades with Egyptian Osiris and Apis. The cult of Serapis provided a common divine figure capable of appealing to both Greek settlers and native Egyptians, uniting the population under a shared theological framework. Temples, coinage, and statues disseminated Serapis' image. The god was depicted in Greek artistic form, bearded, enthroned, and clothed in Hellenistic regalia, while his associations with the afterlife and fertility preserved Egyptian religious concepts. Archaeological evidence from the Serapeum of Alexandria, including inscriptions and reliefs, confirms both the popularity and official sanction of this syncretic cult. Other cities followed similar patterns. In Antioch, the Seleucid capital, Greek gods such as Apollo, Dionysus, and Athena were worshipped alongside Syrian and Mesopotamian deities. Coins and monumental reliefs depict Greek gods with attributes borrowed from local traditions, a practice that facilitated acceptance among diverse populations. Civic festivals, public dedications, and architectural motifs blended Hellenic and local styles, creating spaces where Greek mythic narratives intersected with indigenous ritual. These hybrid forms illustrate the adaptability of Greek religion. Myth could be translated without losing intelligibility, and the gods could speak the language of new cultures while retaining their classical identity. The Hellenistic period also saw the proliferation of mystery cults, offering initiates secret knowledge and promise of personal salvation. The cult of Isis, originally Egyptian, became a prominent presence in Greek cities from Egypt to Asia Minor. Rituals included purification, symbolic death and rebirth, and initiation ceremonies, emphasizing the personal experience of the divine rather than public civic participation. Inscriptions from Delos and Athens document dedications to Isis, often alongside traditional Greek deities, signaling both coexistence and integration. Similarly, the Eleusinian mysteries dedicated to Demeter and Persephone spread beyond Attica, establishing chapters in Hellenistic cities where initiates could partake in secret rites, reinforcing the notion that salvation and divine favor could be individual as well as communal. Pergamon, under the Attalid dynasty, illustrates the deliberate use of religious syncretism for political and cultural purposes. The Attalids constructed monumental temples and altars blending Greek architectural styles with Near Eastern symbolism. For instance, reliefs on the Pergamon altar depict the Gigantomachy, a mythic battle of gods and giants, while incorporating stylistic elements evocative of Mesopotamian and Anatolian art. This fusion not only demonstrated the dynasty's cosmopolitan sophistication, but also presented Greek mythology as universally resonant, capable of legitimizing rule in a multicultural empire. Syncretism was not limited to architecture or cultic images. It extended to philosophical and literary interpretation. Hellenistic thinkers, including the Stoics and Platonists, interpreted gods as principles of order and reason, providing a conceptual bridge between Greek theology and the metaphysical frameworks of Egypt, Persia, and Babylon. Through allegorical readings, familiar deities were identified with universal forces. Zeus became the rational principle governing the cosmos, Dionysus the dynamic energy underlying nature, and Hermes the mediator between the human and divine. Mythic narratives were thus reframed to align with intellectual cosmopolitanism, rendering them intelligible across cultural boundaries. Material culture provides extensive evidence for this syncretic expansion. Coins from Ptolemaic Egypt depict Isis enthroned alongside Hellenistic monarchs. Inscriptions record priestly offices for both Greek and Egyptian cults, and temple foundations combine Doric, Ionic, and Egyptian elements. Red figure pottery and sculptures from Asia Minor show Greek gods adopting local dress or iconography, reinforcing the adaptability of classical mythology. Even domestic shrines reflect hybrid practices. Terracotta figurines of Greek deities appear alongside amulets invoking foreign gods, demonstrating the permeation of syncretism into daily religious life. These developments illustrate how Greek religion became imperial in scope. Unlike the city-centered cults of the classical period, Hellenistic religion transcended political borders, accommodating ethnic and linguistic diversity while maintaining recognizable Greek elements. The gods became cultural diplomats, mediating between populations and providing continuity amid political upheaval. Syncretism ensured the relevance of Greek myth, allowing it to operate as both unifying ideology and adaptable spiritual framework across the vast Hellenistic world. By the 2nd century BCE, the religious landscape of the Mediterranean had been permanently transformed. Greek gods no longer existed solely within the confines of polis ritual or narrative epic. They had acquired new names, forms, and functions, coexisting with Egyptian, Near Eastern, and Anatolian traditions. This cosmopolitanization of religion set the stage for the next major evolution: the incorporation and adaptation of these gods within Roman culture, where Greek myth would be reshaped to serve a new imperial order. Rome would inherit these gods and reshape them anew. In Rome, the Greek gods became eternal citizens. By the late Republic and early Empire, the pantheon of Greek mythology had crossed the Mediterranean once more, entering the political and cultural heart of Rome. The process was both selective and interpretive. Romans adopted the gods of Greece, aligned them with indigenous deities, and repurposed myth for civic, moral, and literary functions. This adaptation was systematic, transforming Olympus from a regional Hellenic framework into a central feature of Roman identity. Inscriptions, coinage, and literary texts document the deliberate integration of Greek divinities into Roman religious and social structures. The identification of Roman gods with their Greek counterparts, known as Interpretatio Graeca, was foundational. Jupiter was equated with Zeus, embodying supreme authority and cosmic order. Venus corresponded to Aphrodite, symbolizing both beauty and civic fertility. Mars combined indigenous martial traditions with the heroic qualities of Ares, and Minerva absorbed Athena's wisdom, strategic skill, and patronage of crafts. Through these equivalences, the Roman state aligned foreign theology with domestic ideology, ensuring that myth served both spiritual and political ends. Temples, altars, and public ceremonies celebrated these gods not only as divine beings, but as guarantors of law, civic duty, and imperial destiny. Literature became the primary medium through which Greek myth was Latinized and canonized. Among the most influential works was Ovid's Metamorphoses, c. 8 CE, an encyclopedic retelling of Greek mythology from creation to deification. Ovid preserved narrative structures, divine genealogies, and heroic exploits, while translating them into Roman cultural and linguistic contexts. Gods, heroes, and monsters populated a world governed by transformation and moral consequence. Jupiter's thunderbolts, Venus' schemes, and Apollo's contests were rendered in Latin verse, making Greek myth accessible to Roman audiences while reinforcing civic and ethical frameworks. The text's enduring popularity attests to the success of this cultural translation. Greek myths retained their narrative force even as they became distinctly Roman. Artistic adaptation accompanied literary transformation. Roman sculpture and painting frequently reproduced Greek prototypes, yet with modifications that reflected Roman ideals and local contexts. The Capitoline Jupiter, for example, echoes the authority of Phidias Zeus but is placed within the civic center of Rome, reinforcing the god's role as protector of the state rather than solely cosmic ruler. Similarly, domestic frescoes and mosaics depict Greek mythic scenes, such as the labors of Hercules or the adventures of Theseus. In homes and villas, integrating myth into daily life as both decoration and moral exemplum. These visual representations reinforced Greek narratives, while embedding them within Roman domestic, political, and religious routines. The adaptation of Greek myth also intersected with Roman political propaganda. Augustus and his successors leveraged divine genealogy to legitimize rule. The Julian family claimed descent from Venus through Aeneas, linking imperial authority to mythic precedent. Coins, public monuments, and triumphal architecture emphasized these connections, transforming myth into an instrument of statecraft. Greek deities became participants in Rome's civic and imperial narrative. Zeus/Jupiter validated law and conquest. Athena/Minerva embodied strategic wisdom. Dionysus/Bacchus symbolized controlled prosperity and civic celebration. Myth thus served as both cultural inheritance and political utility. Religious practice mirrored literary and visual adaptation. Temples, festivals, and priesthoods retained Greek origins, but were framed within Roman civic structures. The Temple of Venus Genetrix in the Forum of Julius Caesar, for instance, combined Hellenic iconography with a distinctly Roman cultic focus, emphasizing both divine favor and genealogical legitimacy. Festivals such as the Ludi Romani incorporated Greek mythic motifs alongside Roman ritual, highlighting the syncretic nature of religious observance. Inscriptions record votive dedications invoking Greek gods in Latin, demonstrating the seamless integration of pantheons and linguistic frameworks. Philosophical engagement further shaped Roman understanding of the divine. Stoics, Epicureans, and Platonists reinterpreted Greek mythology in ways compatible with reason, natural law, and ethical instruction. While gods remained culturally and politically significant, their depiction in philosophical texts emphasized principles rather than personhood. Jupiter as providential order, Minerva as rational intellect, and Bacchus as natural energy. Myth, in this context, became an interpretive tool, bridging narrative tradition with moral and cosmological reflection. By the early imperial period, Greek mythology had been fully naturalized within Roman culture. The gods spoke Latin, resided in Roman civic spaces, and justified social and political structures. Ovid's literary synthesis, artistic reproductions, and civic adoption ensured that Greek myth remained a living framework, capable of shaping ethical, aesthetic, and governmental life. In this way, Rome preserved, transformed, and propagated Hellenic mythology, ensuring its survival through centuries of linguistic, geographic, and political change. Yet philosophy continued to refine the divine. For Plato, myth was reason's shadow, instructive, not literal. In classical Greece, myth had long served as narrative, ritual, and art. Plato, c. 427 to 347 BCE, introduced a new dimension: myth as a vehicle for moral and metaphysical instruction. Rather than recounting divine exploits for entertainment or ritual observance, Platonic myths functioned as pedagogical tools, illustrating ethical principles, cosmological order, and the nature of reality. In dialogues such as the Timaeus, Republic, and Phaedrus, myth is subordinated to reason, yet retains narrative power, providing an accessible medium through which abstract truths could be apprehended. The Timaeus exemplifies Plato's approach to cosmological myth. Here, the creation of the universe is described through the figure of the demiurge, a divine craftsman who orders chaos according to the principle of eternal forms. While the story employs mythic imagery, a world fashioned like a living being, its purpose is didactic. It conveys a structured, rational cosmology in which order emerges from necessity and intelligence. Plato does not invite literal belief in the demiurge as a deity akin to Zeus. Rather, the narrative models cause and effect, proportion, and moral intelligibility. Archaeological and literary evidence confirms that such ideas influenced later Hellenistic thought, bridging mythic narrative with emerging philosophical theology. In the Republic, Plato employs myth to elucidate moral and political truths. The myth of air, recounted at the dialogue's conclusion, describes the afterlife as a realm in which souls choose new lives based on prior conduct. Though couched in vivid imagery, the narrative functions as ethical pedagogy. It illustrates the consequences of justice and injustice, and the rational structure of moral choice. The story integrates metaphysical assumptions with civic ideals, demonstrating how myth can communicate abstract principles in narrative form. Plato's use of myth here reflects a broader Greek tradition. Stories of gods and heroes are interpreted allegorically, not simply recited, emphasizing moral and philosophical education over devotional practice. Similarly, in the Phaedrus, myths of the soul and divine inspiration explore epistemological and aesthetic questions. The allegory of the charioteer and twin horses represents the tension between reason and desire, illustrating the human soul's ascent toward truth. Myths of the Muses and divine madness underscore that divine insight is accessible through contemplation and cultivation, rather than ritual alone. Through these narratives, Plato situates myth within a framework of intellectual refinement, transforming traditional stories into reflections on virtue, knowledge, and the ordering of the cosmos. Platonic myths also had implications for theology. By presenting divine figures and cosmological processes as principles or exemplars, Plato laid the groundwork for conceptualizing the gods as rational forces rather than anthropomorphic arbiters. Zeus, Athena, or Apollo could be understood allegorically, embodiments of order, wisdom, or harmony. This rationalization did not erase myth but reinterpreted it, allowing Greek religion to coexist with philosophical inquiry. Later Hellenistic and Roman thinkers, particularly the Stoics and Middle Platonists, would expand on this approach, integrating myth with metaphysical and ethical systems. Plato's engagement with myth was not purely theoretical. It also influenced education and civic culture. Stories of divine justice, heroism, and cosmic order were incorporated into curricula, forming part of a broader effort to cultivate virtue. By embedding moral instruction within mythic narrative, Plato ensured that philosophy remained accessible to a wider audience, while preserving the symbolic and imaginative power of storytelling. The combination of allegory and pedagogy created a model in which myth was both entertaining and instructive, capable of shaping ethical perception without demanding literal belief. The structural and linguistic characteristics of Platonic myths also reveal deliberate literary strategy. They often employ familiar narrative forms, dialogues, genealogies, and cosmological accounts, yet subtly redirect attention from the literal to the abstract. Terms such as logos, idea, and form recast traditional mythic motifs as metaphysical constructs. By maintaining recognizable elements of Greek mythology while encoding philosophical meaning, Plato ensured continuity with cultural heritage while advancing rational inquiry. In summary, Plato's use of myth demonstrates a transitional moment in Greek religious and intellectual history. Myth was no longer exclusively a record of divine acts or civic cult. It became a tool for reasoning about the cosmos, morality, and the soul. The allegorical method allowed myths to retain narrative appeal while conveying systematic, rational principles. In this sense, Platonic myth bridges traditional religion and philosophical theology, establishing a model in which the stories of gods and heroes could inform ethical reflection and cosmological understanding. His successors would turn allegory into theology. The Stoics found the divine not on Olympus, but in nature itself. During the Hellenistic period, Greek philosophy increasingly interpreted myth through the lens of reason, moving from narrative allegory towards systematic theology. The Stoics, beginning with Zeno of Citium, c. 334 to 262 BCE, and later developed by Cleanthes and Chrysippus, offered a radical reinterpretation of traditional mythology. They transformed the gods from anthropomorphic figures into rational principles embedded in the cosmos, thereby reconciling inherited myth with a universal, intelligible order. In Stoic thought, Zeus was not merely a ruler of gods and men but the embodiment of divine reason, logos, permeating the universe, while other deities, including Hera and Poseidon, could be understood allegorically as aspects of matter, tension, or natural processes. Cleanthes, c. 330 to 230 BCE, in his hymn to Zeus, exemplifies this rationalization. Though cast in the form of a devotional poem, Zeus is presented as the governing principle of the cosmos, a force that organizes and sustains all being. The hymn emphasizes the unity and orderliness of nature, portraying the universe as an intelligent, purposeful system rather than a collection of capricious divine personalities. In this framework, Zeus' traditional narratives, battles, interventions, and familial relationships are reinterpreted as metaphors for natural causation and cosmic law. Allegory thus allows the Stoic thinker to retain the cultural and literary authority of myth while grounding it in philosophy. Chrysippus, c. 279 to 206 BCE, Zeno's successor, extended this approach, systematizing Stoic theology and logic. He argued that the cosmos itself is a living entity, animated by divine reason. Every natural process, from planetary motion to human action, reflects the orderly deployment of logos. Myths of divine conflict or passion are interpreted as symbolic accounts of the interplay between rational order and material resistance. Hera, for example, traditionally the jealous consort of Zeus, is read as matter or passive substrate, providing the necessary conditions for the rational principle to act. Poseidon embodies the dynamic forces of nature, seas, storms, and motion, constrained and guided by Zeus' overarching reason. Such allegorical readings allowed the Stoics to reconcile mythology with emerging scientific understanding, presenting the gods as intelligible, universal forces rather than capricious personalities. The Stoic system also emphasized ethical implications. Humans, as rational beings, participate in the divine logos. Knowledge of the divine order is therefore inseparable from moral development. Living in accordance with reason is both recognition of Zeus' immanence and fulfillment of human purpose. Mythological narratives serve as instructive analogies. Heracles' labors, the trials of Perseus, or the journeys of Odysseus symbolize struggles against natural and ethical challenges, illustrating principles of endurance, prudence, and virtue. Stoic allegory thus transformed myth into ethical pedagogy, teaching the rational observer how to align with universal law. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that Stoic reinterpretation coexisted with traditional cultic practice. Inscriptions and dedications continued to honor Zeus, Athena, and other Olympians according to conventional ritual, even in cities where Stoic philosophy flourished, such as Athens, Rhodes, and Pergamon. The dual existence of allegorical theology and civic worship demonstrates that Stoicism did not replace popular religion but offered a philosophical lens through which to understand it. Myth, in this context, operated on multiple levels. Narrative for the many, rational allegory for the few. The Stoic approach also influenced later Hellenistic thinkers and Roman philosophers. Figures such as Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius integrated Stoic theology into Roman intellectual culture. In their writings, Zeus/Jupiter functions as the rational, ordering principle of the universe. Human beings achieve fulfillment through alignment with cosmic law. Mythical stories were cited as illustrative devices, reinforcing moral and metaphysical lessons. This continuity underscores the enduring capacity of myth to adapt to philosophical scrutiny while retaining cultural resonance. Moreover, Stoic allegory contributed to the long-term intellectual history of Greek mythology. By decoupling divinity from narrative literalism and rooting it in universal reason, the Stoics provided a template for rational theology that informed later Neoplatonism, Christian thought, and even early modern natural philosophy. The integration of myth, ethics, and cosmology created a coherent framework in which the divine was simultaneously narrative, principle, and ethical guide, a model that extended the explanatory power of Greek mythology beyond ritual and literature. In conclusion, the Stoic reinterpretation of myth represents a critical development in the intellectual history of Greek religion. By reading the gods as rational principles, Zeus as logos, Hera as matter, and other deities as natural forces, the Stoics transformed inherited narratives into philosophical instruments. Their work reconciled traditional stories with reason, demonstrating that myth could convey universal truths without reliance on literal belief. At the same time, popular cultic practices persisted, maintaining the social and civic dimensions of worship. Greek mythology thus operated simultaneously as cultural narrative and rational theology, a dual system that would influence Hellenistic, Roman, and later philosophical traditions. But while philosophers allegorized, common worship persisted. Neoplatonists saw in myth the map of the soul's ascent. In the 3rd through 5th centuries CE, Greek mythology underwent a profound intellectual revival within the framework of Neoplatonism, a philosophical movement that sought to unify cosmology, theology, and metaphysics. Founders such as Plotinus, c. 204 to 270 CE, and later interpreters like Proclus, c. 412 to 485 CE, reimagined traditional myths as symbolic representations of spiritual principles, transforming narrative legend into a systematic map of the soul's ascent toward the divine. Myth was no longer a record of historical or civic practice but a tool for understanding metaphysical realities, reconciling inherited polytheism with abstract philosophy. Plotinus, in his Enneads, emphasized the One, the ultimate source of all existence, from which emanated the nous, intellect, and the soul. Myths of the Olympian gods were interpreted allegorically to reflect this hierarchical structure. Zeus, as chief of the pantheon, symbolized the rational principle ordering the cosmos. Athena represented divine wisdom, Apollo the harmonization of intellect and order, and Dionysus the dynamic energies of life and transformation. In this framework, mythic narratives, battles, quests, and transformations were read as illustrations of ontological principles, portraying the soul's movement from material limitation toward unity with the One. This symbolic methodology allowed Neoplatonists to preserve the narrative richness of Greek mythology while subordinating it to philosophical and metaphysical interpretation. Proclus expanded these ideas into a highly systematic theological approach. In his commentaries on Plato and his own treatises, he organized the gods into hierarchies of causation and influence, linking ritual, cosmology, and ethics. Myths, he argued, encoded the operations of divine intellect and soul, providing humans with a symbolic roadmap for understanding both the material and spiritual worlds. Heroic tales, genealogies, and divine exploits were thus interpreted as allegories of cosmic processes and ethical progression, guiding the practitioner toward higher knowledge. Temples, rituals, and art were understood as expressions of these metaphysical truths, reinforcing the symbolic function of myth in both public and private practice. Neoplatonism also incorporated elements from earlier philosophical allegory, including the Stoic identification of Zeus with rational principle and Platonic moral cosmology. However, Neoplatonists went further, emphasizing the ascent of the individual soul through contemplation and spiritual practice. Myth provided the narrative structure necessary for understanding complex metaphysical relationships. The labors of Heracles, the journeys of Odysseus, or the transformations described in Hesiod could be read as stages in the purification and elevation of the soul. Inscriptions, commentaries, and architectural layouts from this period often reflect these symbolic interpretations, demonstrating that mythology was actively integrated into intellectual, religious, and ritual life. This intellectualization of myth did not eliminate its civic or artistic functions. Public festivals, temples, and cultic practices continued, but the elite philosophical interpretation offered a layered understanding that extended beyond literal belief. Myth became both a cultural inheritance and a tool of personal and metaphysical instruction. By reframing gods and heroes as symbols of universal principles, Neoplatonists ensured that Greek mythology retained relevance even as traditional pagan practices faced increasing pressure from emerging monotheistic religions. Artistic production during this period reflected the Neoplatonic approach. Sculptures, reliefs, and mosaics often depicted mythological subjects not merely for aesthetic or cultic purposes, but as visual analogues of metaphysical truths. Representations of divine genealogies, cosmic battles, and heroics were designed to evoke contemplation of the structure and harmony of the cosmos, emphasizing the symbolic and intellectual significance of myth. Archaeological evidence from Athens, Alexandria, and Constantinople demonstrates that these images were integrated into both domestic and public spaces, reinforcing the conceptual continuity between narrative, philosophy, and daily life. The late pagan revival under Neoplatonism represents a culmination of centuries of mythic reinterpretation. From Homeric narrative to philosophical allegory, from civic cult to imperial propaganda, and from moral pedagogy to metaphysical theology. Myth was no longer understood solely as entertainment, ritual practice, or civic identity. It was a medium of universal knowledge, capable of conveying ethical, cosmological, and spiritual truths. By transforming stories of gods and heroes into symbolic metaphysics, Neoplatonists bridged the gap between inherited cultural memory and abstract philosophical inquiry. By the 5th century CE, this intellectualized paganism faced unprecedented challenge. Christianity, increasingly recognized and eventually codified as the state religion, began to supplant traditional Greek cults. Yet the Neoplatonic project preserved mythology's symbolic and philosophical potential, ensuring that the narratives, allegories, and cosmologies of the Greek gods would endure as intellectual heritage, accessible for interpretation long after their ritual contexts faded. Yet a new monotheism was rising to eclipse the old order. For Christianity, the old gods were not false, they were fallen. By the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Christianity emerged as a distinct religious movement within the Greco-Roman world, challenging the cultural and religious authority of traditional Greek and Hellenistic religion. Early Christian thinkers confronted the pantheon of Olympus not merely as theological competitors, but as moral and spiritual threats. Figures such as Justin Martyr, c. 100 to 165 CE, Clement of Alexandria, c. 150 to 215 CE, and later Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 430 CE, articulated systematic critiques of pagan myth, reinterpreting the stories of gods and heroes as allegories of moral error, spiritual delusion, or even demonic deception. This reconfiguration marked a decisive turn in the cultural perception of Greek mythology, casting the familiar figures of Olympus as obsolete or corrupt. Justin Martyr, writing in the mid-2nd century CE, emphasized the incompatibility of pagan religion with the monotheistic and moral framework of Christianity. In his first apology, he argued that the worship of multiple gods represented both ethical confusion and spiritual misguidance, contrasting the capricious, violent, or immoral behaviors of the Olympians with the unity and moral authority of the Christian God. He recast myths as instructive primarily for what they warned against: the dangers of impiety, vice, and superstition. In this reading, the heroic deeds of Heracles or the intrigues of Zeus were not celebrations of virtue, but narrative evidence of the fallen state of humanity and its gods. Clement of Alexandria offered a more nuanced critique, seeking to reinterpret pagan knowledge through a Christian lens. In his Stramata, he acknowledged that Greek myth and philosophy contained elements of truth, particularly in moral instruction, but only when subordinated to divine revelation. Myths, he suggested, could serve as preparatory education for converts, presenting allegories of virtue and vice that pointed toward the Christian moral ideal. The Olympians, in this context, became symbolic markers. Zeus, Apollo, and Athena were no longer objects of worship, but exemplars of moral categories: justice, wisdom, and courage, filtered through the superior framework of Christian ethics. Augustine, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE, codified the polemical stance toward paganism in works such as The City of God. For Augustine, the gods of Greece and Rome were demons masquerading as divinities, their narratives a source of deception that misled human reason and obscured the path to salvation. He traced the origin of pagan cults to spiritual corruption, emphasizing that rituals, temples, and sacrifices, while socially and culturally significant, were spiritually dangerous when directed toward false or fallen powers. Greek myths, he argued, were therefore morally instructive only insofar as they exposed human folly, hubris, and the consequences of sin. Christian critiques were not solely textual. They had material and institutional consequences. Temples that had once hosted civic festivals, sacrifices, and Panhellenic gatherings fell into disuse or were repurposed for Christian worship. Inscriptions, votive offerings, and cult statues were destroyed or relocated, signaling a transformation of public religious space. By the 4th century CE, imperial legislation under Constantine and later Theodosius codified the supremacy of Christianity, outlawing pagan rites and effectively silencing the traditional practice of Greek religion. Temples in Athens, Delphi, and Olympia gradually ceased their function as centers of communal worship, and mythic narratives were increasingly transmitted as literature rather than lived religion. Despite this suppression, the intellectual heritage of Greek myth persisted. Christian apologists did not entirely erase classical narratives. Rather, they recast them, incorporating myth into moral and allegorical instruction. Texts such as the expositions of the Psalms and patristic commentaries referenced heroes and deities to illustrate virtue or warn against vice, demonstrating that Greek mythology remained a tool for ethical reflection even as its religious authority declined. Archaeological evidence shows that statues and reliefs of gods were often retained in domestic or civic spaces, their significance transformed from sacred to decorative or pedagogical. This period also witnessed the transition of myth from ritual practice to literary and intellectual artifact. With temples silenced and sacrifices abandoned, myths were preserved in texts, scholia, and commentaries. Educated elites continued to read Homer, Hesiod, and the classical dramatists, studying mythology as part of cultural and rhetorical training rather than as a guide to divine worship. In this sense, Christianity reshaped the function of myth, preserving its narrative and ethical dimensions while stripping it of overt religious power. By the end of the 5th century CE, the Greek pantheon had effectively lost its public authority. The moral and theological reinterpretations of Justin, Clement, and Augustine had reframed the gods as fallen beings or moral exemplars, and imperial support ensured that Christian monotheism supplanted pagan ritual in both public and private spheres. Yet the stories themselves survived, embedded in literature, art, and philosophy, poised to influence future intellectual and cultural traditions long after the collapse of traditional worship. As doctrine hardened, the temples grew silent. The rites ceased, but the stories endured. By the late 4th century CE, the institutional decline of Greek religion had become decisive. Under Emperor Theodosius I, reigned 379 to 395 CE, a series of legal measures effectively criminalized public pagan worship. In 391 CE, Theodosius issued decrees prohibiting sacrifices, closing temples, and banning traditional festivals. Sanctuaries that had functioned as centers of civic, cultural, and economic life for centuries were shuttered, stripped of ritual implements, and in some cases repurposed for Christian use. Major sites such as the Parthenon in Athens, the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, and the Olympian temples experienced systematic deactivation, marking the formal end of state-supported polytheism in the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological layers from this period show abrupt cessation of votive deposits, destruction of cult statues, and architectural modifications that converted sacred spaces into civic or Christian edifices. Despite these official measures, evidence indicates that popular and rural forms of polytheism persisted for some time. In the countryside, isolated villages continued to maintain shrines, household altars, and local festivals, often in syncretic forms that blended classical Greek gods with folk practices or localized spirits. Inscriptions, terracotta figurines, and votive offerings from rural Anatolia, Thessaly, and Crete suggest that the worship of deities such as Demeter, Dionysus, and Pan continued at a small scale well into the 5th and 6th centuries CE. This persistence of rural religion highlights the gap between official legislation and lived practice, demonstrating that the social and spiritual roots of Greek mythic worship were deep and resilient. Temples, once centers of civic authority, also became repositories of memory. Many were stripped of their statues and ritual paraphernalia but remained architectural markers of Greek religious identity. Travelers, scholars, and local inhabitants preserved knowledge of these sites, transmitting stories of their gods, festivals, and heroic associations orally or through early manuscripts. In urban centers, public ritual declined rapidly, yet the literary and artistic traditions of myth survived in private libraries, school curricula, and elite collections. Homer, Hesiod, dramatists, and Hellenistic poets were copied and studied, ensuring that the narrative corpus of Greek mythology remained culturally alive even as cultic practice disappeared. The closing of sanctuaries also accelerated the transition of myth from ritual experience to textual preservation. Theodosius legislation forced religious knowledge to reside in scrolls, codices, and inscriptions rather than in active worship. Scholars such as Damascius and Simplicius continued to write commentaries on Platonic and Aristotelian texts, often engaging with mythic narratives allegorically or philosophically. These works, while marginal in an increasingly Christian world, preserved sophisticated understandings of cosmology, divine genealogy, and ritual significance. Texts of Hesiod, Homer, and the dramatists were copied and recopied, forming the foundation for medieval and Renaissance reception of Greek mythology. Artistic and archaeological evidence further documents this shift. Statues, reliefs, and temple decorations were frequently relocated, repurposed, or conserved in Christian contexts. For example, architectural fragments from Delphi and Olympia were reused in basilicas or fortifications, preserving the iconography of gods and heroes in secondary roles. Red figure pottery, mosaics, and frescoes depicting mythic narratives continued to circulate, particularly in private villas and urban centers, transmitting visual knowledge of mythology independent of active worship. These artifacts functioned as both aesthetic objects and mnemonic devices, ensuring that the narrative and symbolic content of myth survived even in the absence of ritual practice. The decline of public cults also prompted intellectual preservation efforts. Late pagan philosophers, historians, and grammarians recorded local legends, genealogies, and ritual practices, producing compendia that sought to systematize and memorialize Greek religious culture. Authors such as Pausanias, 2nd century CE, provide detailed accounts of temples, festivals, and sacred topography, offering scholars critical insight into practices that were already diminishing in their own time. These textual records became invaluable sources for later Byzantine and Renaissance scholars, allowing Greek myth to endure beyond the extinction of active cultic communities. By the end of the 5th century CE, Greek polytheism had largely disappeared from public life. Temples were closed, festivals suppressed, and civic priesthoods dissolved. Nevertheless, myths themselves, preserved in literature, art, and scholarly commentaries, maintained their cultural significance. Heroes, gods, and cosmological narratives continued to influence education, philosophy, and artistic production, providing a reservoir of symbolic and ethical material for subsequent generations. In effect, the survival of Greek mythology shifted decisively from altar to ink, from ritual to text, ensuring its transmission long after the practical and institutional foundations of worship had vanished. Their survival would depend on ink, not altar. The Christian monks who copied Homer unknowingly saved Olympus. As public worship of the Greek gods waned under the combined pressures of imperial legislation and the rise of Christianity, the literary and educational preservation of myth became the primary means of transmission. Classical texts, epic poetry, dramatic works, didactic verse, and philosophical treatises were copied, studied, and taught in schools, ensuring that the narratives of Olympus and the heroes remained accessible even as temples fell silent. Greek mythology survived not as lived religion but as cultural and intellectual inheritance, mediated through literacy, pedagogy, and manuscript culture. Central to this process were the grammar schools and educational curricula of late antiquity. From the 4th century CE onward, Greek and Latin texts continued to be read by elite youth, primarily as exercises in language, rhetoric, and moral instruction. Works such as Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Hesiod's Theogony, and the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were studied for their linguistic sophistication, narrative structure, and ethical exemplars. In these contexts, myths functioned as both literary content and moral pedagogy. The exploits of heroes, the interplay of gods and mortals, and the consequences of hubris illustrated lessons in virtue, strategy, and civic responsibility. Teachers often commented on allegorical or symbolic interpretations, subtly preserving philosophical readings of myth alongside narrative understanding. Monastic scriptoria played an equally crucial role. Christian monks, often motivated by the goal of preserving classical learning for educational or rhetorical purposes, copied vast numbers of Greek and Latin manuscripts, including epic, historiographic, and philosophical texts. Works by Homer, Hesiod, Ovid, and Pindar were meticulously transcribed, frequently alongside Christian texts. While the scribes were unlikely to endorse pagan worship, their labor ensured the survival of mythic narratives. Marginal notes, scholia, and commentary preserved explanations of cultic practice, genealogies, and ritual significance, providing later scholars with invaluable context for understanding the religious, cultural, and historical dimensions of these stories. By the Byzantine period, the corpus of classical literature had become codified within intellectual culture. Manuscripts were collected in libraries and monastic centers, where they were read, interpreted, and copied for generations. Educational systems emphasized the memorization and recitation of epic and dramatic texts, ensuring that Greek mythology remained a living part of literary and rhetorical training. Even as the religious function of the gods faded, the narratives themselves provided frameworks for storytelling, allegory, and philosophical reflection. Inscriptions, scholia, and commentaries further supported continuity, explaining obscure mythic references and integrating myth into the broader fabric of Greek literary culture. The preservation of myth through literature was also aided by philological efforts. Scholars meticulously collated variants, compared manuscripts, and annotated texts, clarifying linguistic and narrative ambiguities. Hesiod's genealogies, for example, were preserved through careful copying and marginal commentary, allowing subsequent generations to reconstruct the succession of gods and the thematic logic of myth. Similarly, the tragedies and epics were preserved with attention to meter, vocabulary, and narrative structure, ensuring fidelity to original forms even when their ritual or civic context had disappeared. This literary survival had profound long-term effects. By maintaining access to classical texts, Christian and Byzantine scholars inadvertently created the foundation for the Renaissance revival of Greek mythology. Figures such as Homer, Hesiod, and Ovid would reemerge as central cultural references, influencing European art, literature, and philosophy for centuries. Mythic narratives, once confined to ritual performance or civic display, became objects of study, interpretation, and creative adaptation, securing their place in the intellectual heritage of the West. In conclusion, the endurance of Greek mythology during the decline of pagan cults demonstrates the power of textual transmission and education. While temples were closed and public rites abolished, the gods and heroes of Olympus survived through the written word, embedded in classical education, manuscript copying, and scholarly annotation. Through these mechanisms, the narrative, ethical, and symbolic dimensions of myth persisted, ensuring that the stories of the Greek pantheon remained available for cultural, literary, and intellectual engagement long after their worship had ceased. In Byzantium, these texts became the seed of rebirth. As Constantinople fell, its scrolls carried the gods westward. The survival of Greek mythology into the Renaissance was in large part due to the meticulous preservation of classical texts in the Byzantine Empire. Following the decline of pagan cults and the institutional dominance of Christianity, scholars in Constantinople, Thessalonica, and other centers continued to copy, annotate, and study Greek manuscripts, ensuring that Homer, Hesiod, Pindar, and the dramatists remained accessible. Byzantine scribes preserved both literary and philosophical works, including commentaries on Platonic and Aristotelian allegories, as well as treatises detailing ritual, cultic practice, and mythic genealogy. These manuscripts formed the intellectual bridge between antiquity and the Italian Renaissance, providing the raw material for a cultural revival that would reshape European art, literature, and philosophy. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 accelerated the migration of this intellectual heritage to the West. Scholars, diplomats, and refugees carried codices to Florence, Rome, Venice, and other Italian cities, bringing with them the complete corpus of classical Greek literature. Among these texts were Homeric epics, Hesiodic theogony, and Platonic dialogues, often accompanied by Byzantine scholia that explain genealogies, cultic context, and allegorical interpretations. These manuscripts enabled Renaissance humanists to re-engage with Greek thought directly, bypassing centuries of Latin-mediated transmission. The influx of texts coincided with a growing interest in antiquity, fostering an environment in which mythology could be studied, interpreted, and visually represented with renewed scholarly rigor. Humanist scholars, including Poggio Bracciolini, Marsilio Ficino, and Bessarion, played pivotal roles in translating, annotating, and disseminating these works. Ficino's translations of Plato into Latin, for example, not only reintroduced Greek philosophy to Italian intellectuals, but also revived allegorical readings of myth as ethical and metaphysical instruction. In parallel, classical epics and tragedies provided source material for the study of narrative structure, dramatic composition, and poetic diction. Myth was thus simultaneously an object of philological inquiry and a tool for philosophical reflection, bridging the disciplines of literature, ethics, and aesthetics. The visual arts quickly absorbed these rediscovered narratives. Artists such as Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and Michelangelo drew upon Homer, Ovid, and Hesiod to create paintings, frescoes, and drawings that depicted the gods, heroes, and cosmological scenes of Greek mythology. Classical themes were reinterpreted through Renaissance aesthetics. Proportion, perspective, and anatomical realism were combined with mythic subject matter, producing works that were both scholarly and visually compelling. Botticelli's Birth of Venus, for example, illustrates a fusion of Hesiodic narrative with contemporary ideals of beauty, reflecting both textual knowledge and artistic innovation. The integration of myth into visual culture exemplified a systematic revival, where textual scholarship informed artistic production and vice versa. Education and civic culture reinforced this transmission. In Florence, Rome, and Venice, schools and academies incorporated Greek texts into their curricula, teaching Latin-speaking students to read and interpret original manuscripts. Mythology became central to humanist education, functioning as a moral, rhetorical, and aesthetic resource. Teachers emphasized not only the narratives themselves but also their allegorical and ethical dimensions, echoing ancient Platonic and Neoplatonic traditions. This educational framework ensured that the Greek gods and heroes were not merely subjects of antiquarian interest but living components of intellectual formation for an entire generation of artists, scholars, and thinkers. Printing technology, emerging in the late 15th century, further expanded access to Greek mythology. The translation, typesetting, and dissemination of Homer, Hesiod, and Ovid allowed for wider engagement beyond elite humanist circles. Annotated editions preserved allegorical, moral, and historical commentary, continuing the Byzantine tradition of textual guidance. As a result, Greek myth became a shared cultural repertoire, influencing literature, drama, philosophy, and visual arts across Italy and later, Northern Europe. In sum, the Byzantine preservation of Greek manuscripts and their subsequent transmission to Renaissance Italy created the foundation for the revival of mythology in art and scholarship. The recovery of Homer, Hesiod, and Platonic texts enabled both literary and visual reinterpretation, while humanist education ensured the integration of myth into ethical and aesthetic frameworks. Through these mechanisms, the stories, genealogies, and philosophical interpretations of Olympus migrated from Byzantine codices to the hearts of Florence and Rome, ready to inspire a cultural rebirth that would redefine Western engagement with classical antiquity. In Florence and Rome, the old pantheon took new form. In Renaissance art, myth became the language of beauty. The Renaissance saw Greek mythology emerge not merely as a literary or philosophical corpus, but as a central framework for artistic and aesthetic expression. Italian painters, sculptors, and poets drew extensively on the recovered texts of Homer, Hesiod, Ovid, and the dramatists, using mythic narratives to explore human emotion, beauty, and moral instruction. Myth served simultaneously as aesthetic inspiration, ethical allegory, and a vehicle for intellectual display, reflecting the humanist emphasis on harmonizing classical knowledge with contemporary artistic ideals. Sandro Botticelli's works exemplify this approach. Paintings such as The Birth of Venus and Primavera reinterpret Hesiodic and Ovidian imagery through the lens of Renaissance aesthetics. Venus, rising from the sea or central in a grove of allegorical figures, embodies ideals of proportion, harmony, and divine beauty, while her narrative origin conveys both cosmological and moral symbolism. These compositions were informed by humanist scholarship. The placement of figures, the depiction of anatomy, and the inclusion of mythic iconography demonstrate an integration of textual knowledge, philosophical interpretation, and visual representation. Myth thus functioned as a bridge between classical tradition and contemporary artistic innovation. Michelangelo similarly engaged mythological themes, particularly in his work for patrons steeped in humanist learning. Though primarily known for biblical subjects, his drawings and sketches reveal familiarity with classical mythology, as seen in studies of heroic nudes and allegorical figures. These representations fused mythic narrative with ethical and aesthetic concerns, emphasizing the human form as a vessel for both divine and heroic exemplars. Sculptural commissions often referenced Greco-Roman ideals of proportion, movement, and heroic posture, connecting Renaissance artistic practice to the intellectual and visual heritage of classical mythology. Poetry also embraced myth as a medium for moral and philosophical allegory. Figures such as Pietro Bembo and Poliziano drew on Greek narratives to illustrate ethical dilemmas, human emotion, and civic virtue. Ovid's Metamorphoses provided a particularly rich source, offering transformative narratives that could be interpreted allegorically to reflect moral, intellectual, or aesthetic principles. Humanist poets often emphasized the didactic potential of myth, presenting heroic trials, divine interventions, and cosmological events as reflections on human conduct, ethical responsibility, and the ordering of society. This literary reinterpretation paralleled the visual arts, reinforcing a cultural ecosystem in which myth was both narrative and allegory, past and present, aesthetic and moral. The reimagined pantheon of the Renaissance also engaged with civic and political ideals. Patronage by Florentine elites, the Medici and Roman Curia facilitated artistic projects that drew on mythology to convey power, virtue, and cultural prestige. Gods and heroes were repurposed as exemplars of moral excellence, intellectual prowess, or civic virtue, aligning classical narrative with contemporary social and political aspirations. Apollo's representation as a sun-like rational deity or Minerva's depiction as a guardian of wisdom demonstrates how mythic figures were reinterpreted to convey enduring humanist values, reflecting both scholarly erudition and visual sophistication. Allegory remained central to the Renaissance understanding of myth. As in Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition, myths were read for their ethical, cosmological, and philosophical content, not simply for literal storytelling. Artists and poets treated mythic narratives as symbolic maps of human experience, capable of illustrating moral rectitude, intellectual aspiration, and emotional depth. The depiction of Hercules' labors, Orpheus' journey to the underworld, or the transformation of Daphne into a laurel tree were not merely decorative. They conveyed ethical lessons and aesthetic principles, linking human experience to classical precedent. Educational institutions reinforced this integration of myth into intellectual life. Students in academies and humanist schools studied classical texts alongside visual and literary interpretations, learning to read myth as both historical and moral allegory. Manuscripts, sketches, and commentaries circulated among scholars and artists, creating a shared visual and literary vocabulary that informed public and private art. Through these networks, Greek myth became a cultural lingua franca, providing a means for elite audiences to engage simultaneously with ethics, beauty, and intellectual heritage. By the end of the 16th century, Greek mythology in Renaissance Italy had transformed into a sophisticated cultural system, integrating literature, philosophy, and visual representation. Its narratives, allegories, and symbolic meanings were central to the creation of art, the practice of poetry, and the education of the elite. The pantheon of Olympus, once a living religious framework, had been reshaped into a tool for humanist expression, reflecting the revival of classical thought, the pursuit of beauty, and the articulation of moral and civic ideals. But Enlightenment reason would soon reclaim it for history. The Enlightenment no longer worshipped the gods, it studied them. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Greek mythology underwent a profound transformation under the lens of reason, aesthetics, and emerging historical consciousness. Thinkers and scholars no longer engaged with the gods as objects of worship. Instead, they analyzed myth as literary, artistic, and cultural phenomena, seeking to understand the principles behind narrative structure, artistic representation, and social function. Figures such as Johann Joachim Winckelmann and Johann Gottfried Herder exemplify this Enlightenment approach, combining aesthetic sensibility with historical and philosophical inquiry. Winckelmann, 1717 to 1768, often regarded as the father of modern art history, treated Greek myth primarily through the lens of classical art. In works such as History of Ancient Art, he examined sculpture, vase painting, and reliefs, identifying mythic subjects and interpreting their stylistic qualities. For Winckelmann, myth was inseparable from form. The beauty, proportion, and idealized human anatomy of Greek art conveyed the values, ethics, and cosmology of the civilization. Gods and heroes were thus appreciated not for divine agency, but as embodiments of aesthetic perfection, serving as models for taste, refinement, and artistic emulation. His analyses systematized knowledge of mythic iconography, providing the foundation for modern classical archaeology and art history. Herder, 1744 to 1803, by contrast, emphasized the cultural and historical dimensions of mythology. He argued that myths reflected the spirit, Volksgeist of particular peoples, encoding their moral, social, and environmental experiences. In this framework, Homeric epics, Hesiodic cosmogony, and dramatized myth were understood as expressions of collective human consciousness, revealing insights into values, beliefs, and communal identity. Herder's approach positioned mythology as a human creation rather than divine revelation, anticipating comparative and anthropological methods that would emerge in the 19th century. Enlightenment thinkers also increasingly applied rational and historical criticism to myths. They examined inconsistencies, chronological anomalies, and cultural borrowing, distinguishing between literary invention, symbolic narrative, and historical events. Myths were no longer treated as explanations of natural phenomena or moral law. They were interpreted as cultural artifacts, products of imagination and social context. This approach enabled scholars to classify myths, trace their evolution across regions, and compare Greek narratives with other traditions, establishing the foundation for modern philology, comparative religion, and classical studies. The dissemination of myth in the Enlightenment era extended through printed books, illustrated editions, and scholarly treatises. Artists, Writers and educators accessed carefully edited versions of classical texts alongside interpretive commentary. Illustrations of mythic scenes became widely circulated, blending aesthetic study with historical knowledge. By transforming Greek mythology into a subject of systematic inquiry, the Enlightenment shifted the focus from devotion to analysis, creating a framework in which myth could inform literature, pedagogy, art criticism, and intellectual history. This period also codified a distinction between myth and religion. While pagan deities had once been objects of ritual and civic authority, Enlightenment scholarship recast them as symbolic or narrative constructs, to be studied and understood rather than adored. Ethical, cosmological, and heroic narratives were interpreted allegorically, historically, or aesthetically, and mythic knowledge became part of the educational and cultural capital of Europe's intellectual elite. Greek mythology was no longer living religion. It was now an object of humanistic and scientific study. By the close of the 18th century, myth had been firmly integrated into the corpus of modern scholarship. Winckelmann's emphasis on aesthetic form, Herder's focus on cultural context, and the rationalist critique of earlier narratives established enduring methodologies for understanding mythology. Greek gods and heroes, once worshipped or allegorized for ethical instruction, were now treated as sources for art, history, and human thought, accessible to systematic analysis rather than ritual practice. The modern era would turn mythology into science. Victorian scholars sought the laws of myth as others sought the laws of nature. In the 19th century, Greek mythology entered a new phase of systematic analysis through the emerging disciplines of comparative mythology and anthropology. Scholars sought to understand myths not simply as literary or artistic artifacts, but as cultural phenomena reflecting universal patterns of human thought and social organization. This period marked a shift from aesthetic and historical study to a broader search for underlying structures in myth across civilizations, positioning Greek narratives as both exemplary and representative within a global framework. Max Muller, 1823 to 1900, a pioneering philologist, approached mythology through the lens of language and etymology. He argued that many mythic narratives originated as nature myths, with gods and heroes representing elemental forces, celestial bodies, or natural phenomena. In Greek myth, for example, he interpreted Zeus as a symbolic representation of the sky and thunder, Demeter as the earth's fertility, and Poseidon as the sea's power. Muller's approach emphasized the linguistic and symbolic encoding of natural experience, tracing how human communities projected environmental and cosmological realities onto mythic figures. His methodology combined rigorous textual analysis with cross-cultural comparison, laying the foundation for the systematic study of myth as an intellectual discipline. James Frazer, 1854 to 1941, in his monumental work The Golden Bough, extended comparative analysis into the realm of ritual and social practice. Frazer treated Greek mythology as part of a wider corpus of Indo-European and global mythic traditions, identifying recurring motifs such as sacred kingship, seasonal fertility cycles, and ritual sacrifice. He analyzed the myths of Heracles, Dionysus, and Persephone not merely as stories, but as reflections of social and religious structures, often linked to agricultural or civic calendars. Frazer's interpretive model emphasized ritual as the root of myth, suggesting that narrative evolved to explain and justify communal practice. Greek mythology thus became a key case study in understanding the functional relationship between myth, society, and nature. Other anthropologists and folklorists further expanded this comparative framework. Scholars such as Edward Burnett Tyler and Andrew Lang examined Greek myths alongside African, Asian, and Native American traditions, identifying shared archetypes and narrative patterns. Themes of heroism, divine hierarchy, and cosmic struggle were analyzed as universal human constructs, revealing insights into cognition, social organization, and moral imagination. Greek myth, with its rich textual preservation and artistic representation, provided a particularly fertile ground for testing these hypotheses, enabling researchers to combine archaeological, literary, and ethnographic evidence. The methodology of 19th-century comparative mythology also emphasized classification and taxonomy. Myths were grouped by type, motif, and function, allowing scholars to trace genealogies of narrative forms and cultural diffusion. For instance, the labors of Heracles were compared with hero myths from Mesopotamia, India, and Scandinavia, revealing recurring themes of trial, transformation, and triumph. Similarly, Greek cosmogonies were placed in dialogue with Babylonian, Egyptian, and Norse traditions to explore shared cosmological conceptions and mythic structures. These comparative studies framed Greek mythology not as isolated literature but as a component of a broader, cross-cultural intellectual phenomenon, illustrating the universality of human narrative imagination. This era also introduced a scientific rigor to the study of mythology. Scholars sought causal explanations for mythic development, whether linguistic, social, or psychological. Myths were analyzed as adaptive responses to environmental, cultural, and moral challenges, bridging philology, anthropology, and emerging social sciences. Greek mythology served as both subject and model, providing a well-preserved corpus for examining how stories evolve, transmit, and encode knowledge across generations. By framing myth as an object of systematic inquiry, 19th-century scholarship positioned Greek narratives at the intersection of art, literature, and the social sciences, laying the groundwork for modern theoretical approaches. By the end of the 19th century, the comparative study of myth had established Greek mythology as a scientifically analyzable cultural system. Researchers recognized the interconnection between narrative, ritual, and social structure, while emphasizing both the uniqueness and the universality of Greek stories. The methods developed by Mahler, Fraser, and their contemporaries shaped subsequent scholarship, influencing 20th-century approaches in psychology, sociology, and literary studies. Greek myths were no longer solely objects of aesthetic appreciation or historical interest. They became empirical data for understanding human cognition, culture, and society. In the 20th century, myth moved from anthropology to psychology. For modern thinkers, the gods were the architecture of the mind. In the 20th century, Greek mythology became a central object of psychoanalytic and structural analysis, shifting the focus from cultural and historical context to the workings of the human psyche and social cognition. Scholars and theorists examined myths as expressions of unconscious patterns, archetypal structures, and universal narrative codes. In this framework, gods, heroes, and cosmic narratives were understood not primarily as historical or ritual phenomena, but as symbolic representations of human thought, emotion, and social organization. Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, was among the first to interpret myth through psychoanalytic theory. In works such as Totem and Taboo, he proposed that myths reflected deeply rooted psychological conflicts, particularly those related to family dynamics, authority, and desire. Greek myths, for instance, were analyzed in terms of Oedipal tension, sibling rivalry, and paternal authority, with Zeus' rule over Olympus, the labors of Heracles, and the punishment of Prometheus serving as symbolic enactments of universal psychic structures. Myths were seen as projections of unconscious impulses, codified into narrative forms that allowed societies to process complex emotions and anxieties. Carl Gustav Jung, 1875 to 1961, expanded this approach by emphasizing archetypes and the collective unconscious. He argued that figures such as Athena, Apollo, and Dionysus embodied recurring archetypal motifs: the wise mother, the heroic warrior, the ecstatic reveler, which appeared across cultures and historical periods. Greek mythology, with its clearly defined gods and richly interwoven narratives, provided a particularly clear illustration of these patterns. According to Jung, mythic narratives functioned as psychic maps, guiding individual and collective engagement with universal human experiences such as birth, death, transformation, and moral choice. In this way, Greek gods were understood as enduring symbols embedded in the human psyche, offering insight into both personal and collective consciousness. The structuralist approach, pioneered by Claude Lévi-Strauss, 1908 to 2009, reconceived myth as a system of relations rather than discrete stories. Lévi-Strauss analyzed Greek myths as binary oppositions: life versus death, culture versus nature, order versus chaos, and studied the transformations of these oppositions within narrative structures. The labors of Heracles, the journeys of Odysseus, and the tragic fates of Oedipus and Agamemnon were interpreted as combinatory patterns, revealing the underlying logic of human cognition and social reasoning. By focusing on structural relationships, scholars demonstrated that myths functioned as cognitive tools for resolving contradictions, encoding social norms, and transmitting cultural knowledge through narrative form. Joseph Campbell, 1904 to 1987, further popularized the structural approach through his concept of the monomyth or hero's journey. He traced recurrent narrative arcs across global mythology, identifying stages of departure, initiation, and return. Greek myths, particularly those involving heroic quests, divine intervention, and transformation, exemplified these universal patterns. In Campbell's analysis, heroes like Perseus, Theseus, and Odysseus were not merely historical or literary figures, but symbolic representations of human experience, providing audiences with archetypal models of courage, intelligence, and moral growth. Myth became a template for understanding both the psychological development of the individual and the collective narratives of society. Psychoanalytic and structural interpretations shared a common principle. Greek mythology was less about the literal truth of divine beings than about the symbolic and functional roles these narratives played. They revealed cognitive structures, ethical dilemmas, and emotional landscapes embedded in culture. Myths were simultaneously tools for psychological insight, mirrors of social norms, and guides for moral reflection. The gods and heroes of Olympus became instruments for exploring human consciousness, illustrating patterns of desire, fear, ambition, and ethical reasoning that transcend historical and geographic boundaries. Despite the theoretical reframing, the narratives themselves remained vibrant. The myths continued to be retold, reinterpreted, and adapted in literature, art, and popular culture. Psychoanalytic and structuralist approaches did not eliminate the narrative richness of Greek mythology. Rather, they provided frameworks for understanding why these stories endured, why they resonated across centuries, and why they continued to inspire artistic and intellectual engagement. Literature, theater, and visual arts continued to draw on the enduring imagery, drama, and ethical complexity of the myths, demonstrating their resilience even in the context of rigorous theoretical scrutiny. By the mid-20th century, Greek mythology had been firmly established as a subject of interdisciplinary study, encompassing psychology, anthropology, literature, and philosophy. The gods, heroes, and cosmogonies of Olympus were simultaneously historical artifacts, literary masterpieces, and symbolic structures embedded in the human mind. Their study revealed the deep architecture of thought, emotion, and culture, while ensuring that the narratives themselves remained accessible, engaging, and continually reimagined. Yet amid theory, the myths themselves endured retold, reimagined. Today, Greek myth belongs to no temple, only to knowledge. In the later 20th century, Greek mythology entered an era of critical synthesis and interdisciplinary reinterpretation, shaped by historians, classicists, and cultural theorists who viewed myth not as a psychological archetype or structural code, but as a dynamic system of meaning within historical context. The works of Jean-Pierre Vernant, Walter Burkert, and their successors integrated anthropology, sociology, and philology to reconstruct the social realities that had produced myth. The emphasis shifted once again, from the inner mind and abstract structures to the collective institutions, rituals, and political life that sustained Greek religion and storytelling. Jean-Pierre Vernant, 1914 to 2007, redefined myth as a form of cultural discourse embedded in the social and political structures of ancient Greece. Drawing from structuralism and sociology, Vernant argued that myths expressed the logic of the polis, mirroring tensions between individual and community, freedom and order, fate and autonomy. His analyses of Prometheus, Oedipus, and Dionysus illuminated how Greek narratives articulated evolving concepts of law, justice, and civic responsibility. Myth, for Vernant, was not an isolated fiction or mere reflection of ritual, but a symbolic framework through which the Greeks conceptualized social experience and human agency. Walter Burkert, 1931 to 2015, approached Greek mythology from a complementary but more historical and ritualistic standpoint. In works such as Homo Nikins and Greek religion, Burkert emphasized the biological and anthropological origins of ritual behavior, interpreting myth as the narrative expression of shared acts of sacrifice and worship. He treated stories of the gods not as literary allegories but as mnemonic systems for the performance of communal rites, connecting mythic structure to practical religious action. Archaeological evidence, inscriptions, and sacrificial calendars were integrated into his interpretations, grounding myth in observable human behavior and social cohesion. Together, Vernant and Burkert marked a decisive movement toward contextual and empirical approaches, situating myth within the broader mechanisms of human culture. Their work demonstrated that myth could be studied simultaneously as literature, social code, and ritual script, a multi-layered phenomenon that revealed the moral, political, and cognitive dimensions of ancient life. Their influence extended across disciplines, shaping how mythology was taught in universities and presented to the public. Greek myth became not only a source of inspiration but a model for analyzing how societies create meaning through narrative. In the postmodern period, scholarship further diversified. Theorists such as Marcel Détienne, Nicole Lorox, and Richard Buxton explored how gender, power, and language shaped the construction of mythic identities. Feminist and post-structuralist readings reconsidered figures like Athena, Aphrodite, and Medea as symbols of social negotiation and cultural tension, revealing how myth both reflected and contested ancient hierarchies. Meanwhile, in literary and educational contexts, mythology was increasingly framed as a discursive network rather than a fixed canon, adaptable to new interpretations and contemporary ethical questions. In modern education, Greek mythology occupies a central place in the humanities. It serves as an entry point into classical thought, comparative religion, philosophy, and art history, linking the ancient Mediterranean world to modern intellectual inquiry. From primary curricula to advanced scholarship, the study of myth continues to provide students with a framework for understanding narrative, symbolism, and human belief systems. The myths of Greece persist not through worship but through analysis, surviving in academic syllabi, university courses, and digital archives that preserve and reinterpret them for new generations. The contemporary study of Greek mythology thus represents the culmination of over 2 millennia of interpretation, from oral tradition and poetic codification to philosophical allegory, theological critique, and modern theory. What began as sacred narrative now functions as a shared intellectual heritage, bridging disciplines and cultures. Through rigorous historical method and interpretive diversity, scholars have ensured that the myths of Greece remain a living field of inquiry, continually recontextualized to address the questions of each new age. But its stories still speak to modern art, film, and identity. The gods returned, not in temples, but in novels and canvases. In the modern era, Greek mythology experienced a profound cultural revival, not as religious practice but as symbolic and aesthetic inspiration. Writers, poets, and visual artists drew upon the enduring narratives of Olympus to explore human experience, identity, and the complexities of modern life. From early 20th century modernism to contemporary visual arts, myth functioned as a framework for narrative experimentation, allegorical depth, and ethical reflection, demonstrating the adaptability and continued relevance of classical stories. Literature was among the most prominent arenas for myth's modern resurgence. Authors such as James Joyce T.